a single subway seat, a moment of kindness no one noticed. But someone did, and that someone held the power to change everything. What happens when a billionaire decides your life needs saving? When generosity becomes control and help becomes something darker? One exhausted father is about to discover that the most dangerous gifts come wrapped in good intentions. This is the story of Ethan Brooks, a man who lost everything but his dignity and the woman whose wealth couldn't buy what he had. Stay until the end, hit that like button, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights of the downtown subway station flickered with their usual arrhythmic pulse, casting sickly shadows across the cracked tile floor. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, that dead zone between the office exodus and the evening shift change when the trains ran just full enough to be uncomfortable but not quite packed enough to justify the discomfort. The platform smelled of brake dust, old coffee, and that particular urban musk that came from too many bodies passing through too small a space for too many years. Ethan Brooks stood near the yellow safety line, his daughter Maya's small hand tucked firmly in his own. She was 6 years old, gap-toothed, with dark curls that refused to be tamed no matter how carefully he brushed them each morning. Right now, those curls were partially hidden beneath a purple knit cap, handmade by a neighbor 2 Christmases ago, already showing wear at the edges but still Maya's favorite thing in the world. "Daddy, my feet hurt," Maya said, not whining exactly, just stating a fact the way children do when they trust the adult beside them to acknowledge their reality. "I know, sweetheart. Just a few more stops, then home. Mrs. Chen is making soup tonight, remember? She said she'd save us some." Maya's face brightened at that. Mrs. Chen's soup was legendary in their building, a rotating cast of ingredients that somehow always tasted like comfort, like someone gave a damn whether you'd eaten that day. The train arrived with a hydraulic sigh and a screech of metal that set Ethan's teeth on edge. The doors opened, releasing a wave of commuters who moved with the dead-eyed efficiency of people who'd made this journey 1,000 times before. Ethan waited for the flow to reverse, then stepped aboard, guiding Maya ahead of him, his hand never leaving her shoulder. The car was fuller than he'd hoped. Every seat occupied, the standing room already claimed by those who'd boarded at earlier stops. Ethan positioned himself near a pole, pulling Maya in front of him so she could hold on with both hands. She barely reached the lower grip, had to stand on her tiptoes to get a proper hold. "I've got you," Ethan murmured, bracketing her with his arms as the train lurched into motion. His backpack, canvas, 15 years old, held together by determination and duct tape, pressed against his spine. Inside, Maya's library books, his work thermos, a Tupperware container with the remains of the lunch he'd packed at 5:30 that morning. Also inside, 3 bills he'd picked up from the mailbox that he hadn't opened yet because he already knew what they said and didn't need the specific numbers to ruin his evening before it had even started. The train settled into its rhythm, that particular rocking motion that could lull you half to sleep if you let it. Ethan didn't let it. He'd learned years ago to stay alert, to track the faces around him, not out of paranoia but out of the simple calculus of single parenthood. He was Maya's everything, which meant he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Around them, the usual subway orchestra played its familiar tune, the tinny leak of someone's headphones playing music mixed too loud, the rustle of newspaper pages, an increasingly rare sound in the age of phones, the rhythmic scrape of someone's wheeled briefcase failing to stay put despite its owner's best efforts, the occasional cough, the cleared throat, the murmured phone conversation that probably could have waited. Maya hummed something under her breath, part of a song from the animated movie they'd watched last Sunday, their weekly tradition that cost nothing but meant everything. Ethan felt something in his chest loosen slightly, that constant tension that had become so familiar he only noticed it when it eased. These were the moments that mattered, he reminded himself. Not the bills in his backpack, not the shift supervisor who'd been on his case about his attitude lately, as if quiet competence was somehow a character flaw. Not the fact that his work boots were developing a hole in the left sole that he'd been patching with cardboard for the past 3 weeks. Just this. His daughter, safe, humming, her hand wrapped around the pole with complete trust that he'd keep her steady. The train pulled into the next station, Lexington Avenue, the platform even more crowded than the last. The The doors opened to a wall of waiting passengers, all of them wearing that particular expression of grim determination that came from knowing you were about to force your body into a space that logic suggested could not accommodate one more human being. Somehow, physics bent. They boarded. Among them was a woman in her mid-50s, though she carried herself with a weariness that added years to her appearance. She wore an expensive coat. Ethan had spent enough time in the background of wealthy people's lives to recognize quality when he saw it, but it hung on her frame in a way that suggested she'd bought it in a different season of her life, when things fit better. Her hair was pulled back severely, her face carefully composed into that mask of controlled exhaustion worn by people who couldn't afford to show weakness in public. She stepped into the car, her eyes scanning for what everyone searched for: a seat, any seat, just somewhere to stop holding yourself up for a few minutes. There were none. Ethan watched her shoulders drop almost imperceptibly, that micro-expression of defeat that flickered across her face before she locked it down again. She moved deeper into the car, found a position near another pole, and wrapped her fingers around the metal with the careful grip of someone whose hands hurt. The train lurched forward again. Maya's humming continued, oblivious to the small human dramas unfolding in every square foot of the subway car. Ethan found himself watching the woman peripherally, something in her exhaustion resonating with his own in a way he couldn't quite name. Not attraction. He'd sealed that part of himself off when Jennifer died, packed it away in the same mental storage where he kept all the other things he couldn't afford to feel. But recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that they were both running on fumes, both pretending to have more left in the tank than they actually did. 3 stops passed. The woman's grip on the pole adjusted slightly with each lurch of the train, her body swaying in that way that suggested her legs were having an argument with her spine about who should bear the burden of keeping her upright. At the 4th stop, 2 seats opened simultaneously as a couple stood to exit. There was a brief moment, maybe half a second, when the car's population did that collective calculus about who deserved those seats more, who'd claim them fastest, whether anyone would actually make a move. Ethan was closer to one of them, close enough that Maya could have slid into it easily, could have rested those feet that she'd told him hurt 45 minutes ago. He looked at the woman by the pole, looked at Maya, looked back at the woman. "Come on, Maya Bird," he said softly, using the nickname that had somehow stuck since she was 2. "Let's move down a bit." "But Daddy," Maya started, because she was 6 and could absolutely see the empty seat right there, could feel how much her feet hurt, could sense that her father was choosing something that didn't make immediate sense. "Trust me, sweetheart." Maya, who'd been raised on trust because it was the only currency Ethan had in abundance, nodded. Ethan caught the woman's eye, jerked his head slightly toward the seat. For a moment she didn't understand, or didn't believe. People didn't give up seats in New York, not really. Not unless you were obviously pregnant or visibly disabled or so old that watching you stand felt like witnessing an act of cruelty. "Please," Ethan said, the single word cutting through the subway noise. "You look like you need it more than we do." Something shifted in the woman's face, a crack in that careful composure. Not gratitude exactly, though there was that too. Something deeper, more primal. The shock of being seen not as important or powerful or worthy of deference for any reason other than simple human need. She moved toward the seat, each step measured. "Thank you," she said, her voice rougher than he'd expected, like it had traveled through thorns to reach her mouth. "You don't—" "Thank you." Ethan just nodded, already guiding Maya further down the car to where another pole offered purchase. He didn't think about it, didn't pause to congratulate himself on being a good person or teaching his daughter a valuable lesson. It was just what you did. If you'd been raised right, if you remembered that everyone was fighting battles you couldn't see. The woman sank into the seat with a small, involuntary sound. Relief or pain or both. Ethan deliberately didn't look. There was a dignity in not watching people's vulnerable moments, in granting them the privacy of their own exhaustion. Maya wrapped her hands around the new pole, had to stretch even more to reach it. Ethan positioned himself behind her again, his world narrowing to this small space, this protective circle, this simple geometry of father and daughter against the evening commute. "Daddy?" Maya's voice was quiet enough that only he could hear. "Yeah, sweetheart?" That was nice, what you did. Ethan felt something warm and painful bloom in his chest, the complicated cocktail of pride and sorrow that came with raising a child alone. Pride that she'd noticed, that at 6 years old she was already learning to see kindness as worth remarking upon. Sorrow that she had to learn these lessons in subway cars because there was no other classroom available, no protected childhood space where morality could be taught in the abstract rather than the concrete. Just trying to be the kind of person worth knowing, he said, which was something Jennifer used to say back when she was alive, back when they'd had those late-night talks about what kind of parents they wanted to be. The train swayed. The evening pressed forward. Around them, the other passengers remained locked in their individual bubbles of commute consciousness, already forgetting the small transaction they'd witnessed, if they'd noticed it at all. But the woman in the seat, though Ethan didn't know it, though she'd given no indication beyond that rough-edged thank you, was not forgetting. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she'd spent the last 23 years building an empire on the principle that sentiment was weakness, that efficiency was everything, that the world divided cleanly into those who produced and those who consumed. And yet here, in this subway car that smelled of brake dust and broken dreams, something had cracked in her carefully constructed worldview. Not broken, not yet, just cracked, just enough to let in a sliver of uncomfortable light. She sat in that seat Ethan had given her, her expensive coat creasing beneath her, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The simple, devastating gift of being treated as human rather than important. They would not speak again, would not exchange names or numbers or any of the social pleasantries that usually marked encounters between strangers. In another minute, Ethan and Maya would exit at their stop, 125th Street, where the buildings were older and the streets were louder and the rent was almost manageable if you didn't need luxuries like consistent heat or hot water. Claire would ride another 8 stops to her penthouse in Tribeca, where the windows overlooked the Hudson, and the silence was so complete you could hear your own thoughts echoing back at you. They would part as strangers. The train would swallow the moment, digest it, excrete it into the great mass of forgotten urban interactions that happen 10,000 times a day in a city of 8 million souls. Except that some moments refuse to be forgotten, no matter how small they seem. Some acts of kindness lodge themselves in the complicated machinery of a person's consciousness and begin, slowly, inexorably, to change the gear's rotation. Clara Whitmore would go home that night and pour herself the expensive scotch she always poured, would stand at her floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she'd conquered, and would find herself unable to stop thinking about a man who'd given up a seat. Not because he wanted something, not because he recognized her. She was reasonably certain he hadn't. Her face was famous in certain circles, but the subway wasn't one of them. Because he'd simply seen someone who needed to sit down and had made space for that need. The thought would keep her awake long past her usual bedtime, would follow her into the next day's board meeting where she'd find herself distracted during a presentation on quarterly earnings, wondering about the man with the daughter, about what kind of life produced that reflexive kindness. But that was later. For now, in this moment, Ethan Brooks stood on a moving train with his daughter's hands wrapped around a pole, his backpack heavy with unpaid bills, his boots developing a hole he didn't have the money to fix. 2 more stops, he said to Maya, checking the map above the door more out of habit than need. He knew this route the way he knew his own breathing, unconsciously, perfectly, with the deep knowledge that came from repetition and necessity. Maya nodded, her humming returning. Some snippet of melody from a movie about princesses and magic and happy endings. Ethan didn't have the heart to tell her that real life didn't work that way, that magic was just another name for luck, and luck was a commodity in shorter supply than subway seats during rush hour. Instead, he just held on to the pole, kept his daughter steady, and counted down the minutes until they could climb the stairs back to street level, back to their 4th-floor walk-up, back to Mrs. Chen's soup and the evening routine that kept chaos at bay. The train pulled into 125th Street. Ethan guided Maya toward the doors, his hand on her shoulder, his body angled to shield her from the press of boarding passengers. They stepped onto the platform together, were immediately swallowed by the crowd, just 2 more anonymous figures in the endless stream of New Yorkers making their way home. Behind them, still seated, Clara Whitmore watched them go. Watched the man's hand never leave his daughter's shoulder, watched the daughter's complete trust in that guidance. Watched them disappear into the human river that flowed toward the stairs. The doors closed. The train moved on. And in that moment, though neither of them knew it, though the universe gave no indication that anything significant had occurred, two trajectories had begun to intersect. Not collide, not yet, just intersect, drawn together by the strange gravity that sometimes pulls people toward each other for reasons that won't become clear until much, much later. Ethan and Maya climbed the stairs from the subway platform, each step a small negotiation between momentum and exhaustion. The evening air hit them, cold enough to bite, thick with the smell of roasting nuts from a street vendor and the diesel exhaust of a bus pulling away from the curb. "Can we get nuts?" Maya asked, not because she was particularly hungry, but because the question was part of their ritual, asked and answered the same way every Tuesday. "Next week, maybe," Ethan said, which was what he always said, which they both knew meant no but sounded gentler than no, left room for hope, even when hope was in short supply. They walked the 4 blocks to their building, past the bodega with the cat that slept in the window, past the church with the sign that hadn't been updated in 6 months, past the lot that had been under development for 3 years and showed no signs of developing into anything other than a place where wind-blown trash gathered in the corners. Their building was pre-war, which was real estate speak for old and probably has asbestos somewhere. 6 stories. Brick facade that might have been handsome once, but now just looked tired. Fire escape zigzagging down the front like a scar. The front door required a specific jiggle of the key and a firm shoulder against the warped wood. Ethan had the technique down. The lobby, if you could call it that, smelled of radiator steam and someone's dinner, something with garlic and tomato. The elevator had been broken for 8 months. The landlord kept promising to fix it. Everyone had stopped believing him around month 3. They climbed. Maya counted the steps out loud until she got to 37, then switched to humming again, because counting was boring and humming was not. Ethan's knees protested around the second-floor landing. That particular ache that came from 8-hour shifts doing maintenance work at the Grandview Hotel downtown, where rich people complained that their rooms were too cold or too hot, or the towels weren't soft enough, as if the universe owed them perpetual comfort. 4th floor. Apartment 4C. Home. Ethan unlocked the 3 different locks, deadbolt, chain, and the knob lock that didn't actually work, but he kept locked anyway out of habit. The door swung open to reveal their tiny kingdom, a railroad apartment carved out of what had probably once been a single large room. Living room that flowed into Maya's bedroom, that flowed into Ethan's bedroom, that flowed into a kitchen barely large enough for one person to turn around in. But it was clean. That was non-negotiable. Ethan might not be able to afford much, but he could afford soap and elbow grease, could make sure that their small space didn't become squalid, didn't succumb to the entropy that poverty invited. "Homework first, then dinner," Ethan said, shrugging off his backpack, wincing slightly as the motion pulled at the muscle in his shoulder that had been bothering him for 2 weeks now. "Do I have to?" Maya asked, but she was already dropping her own backpack by the small desk they'd set up in the corner of her room. A door balanced on milk crates, functional if not elegant. "Education's important, Maya Bird. It's the one thing nobody can take from you once you've got it." This was another ritual response, worn smooth with repetition. Jennifer had said it first, back when they'd both believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to build a life on. She'd been a teacher, had believed in education the way some people believed in God, as a force of redemption, a ladder out of whatever hole circumstance had dropped you into. She'd been wrong, of course. Education was important, sure, but it wasn't magic. It couldn't stop drunk drivers from running red lights, couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't turn back time to the moment before everything had shattered. But Ethan kept saying it anyway, because what else did he have to give his daughter except the beliefs he'd inherited from a woman who'd loved them both more than her own life? Maya pulled out her homework folder, spelling words this week, 20 of them, each one to be written 5 times. Tedious work, but necessary. Ethan had learned that education at this level was mostly about building tolerance for tedium, for following instructions, for doing what you were told even when it seemed pointless. He moved into the kitchen, such as it was. Opened the cabinet above the sink, surveyed their options. Rice, definitely. A can of beans. Some frozen vegetables that were probably still good, though the bag had that frostbitten look that suggested they'd been in the freezer longer than optimal. Mrs. Chen's soup would help. She was on the second floor, had lived in this building for 30 years, had watched the neighborhood change and change back and change again. She'd known Jennifer, had cried at the funeral, had quietly adopted Ethan and Maya into her circle of care in the way that some people did, that network of mutual support that developed in buildings like this, where everyone was struggling and so everyone understood. There was a knock at the door, soft, 3 taps. That was Mrs. Chen's signature. Ethan opened up. Mrs. Chen stood there, tiny and wrinkled and indomitable, holding a container of soup that was still steaming.
"I made too much," she said, which was what she always said, which was transparently untrue but allowed everyone to maintain dignity. "You help me, okay? I cannot eat all this." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Ethan said, accepting the container with both hands. The warmth of it seeped through the plastic into his palms, a small comfort that was larger than its size. "Maya doing homework?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good girl. Smart girl." Mrs. Chen peered past him into the apartment, as if checking to make sure everything was in order, that Ethan was holding things together. Satisfied with whatever she saw, she nodded. "You working tomorrow?" "Every day this week." "You look tired." Ethan almost laughed at that. Tired was his baseline now, the default setting of his existence. "I'm okay." Mrs. Chen's expression suggested she didn't believe him, but she didn't push. That was the thing about Mrs. Chen. She helped, but she didn't pry. She understood the delicate balance between support and intrusion, knew instinctively where that line fell. "You need anything, you knock, okay?" She was already retreating toward the stairs, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones ached, but whose spirit refused to acknowledge it. "Thank you," Ethan said again, because there weren't enough ways to say thank you, weren't enough words to encompass the gratitude he felt toward the people like Mrs. Chen, who kept him and Maya afloat. He closed the door, carried the soup to the kitchen, began the familiar choreography of preparing dinner. Rice in the cooker, soup reheated on the stove, frozen vegetables microwaved. It wasn't elaborate, but it was hot, and it was nutritious, and it would fill their stomachs for another night. In her room, Maya worked through her spelling words with the intense concentration that 6-year-olds brought to tasks they took seriously. Ethan could hear her muttering under her breath, sounding out syllables, her pencil scratching against the paper. He pulled the bills from his backpack while the soup heated. Might as well face them now, get it over with. 3 envelopes, electric, medical, and something from Maya's school about the spring trip to the Science Museum. Electric, past due. Threatening disconnection if not paid within 10 days. Medical, still climbing from Jennifer's hospital stay 3 years ago, that nightmare of bills that seemed to multiply like cancer cells, metastasizing through his financial life. School trip, $45, which might as well have been $400 for all the likelihood he had of pulling it together. Ethan set the bills aside, face down, as if not looking at them would somehow make them less real. He'd figure it out. He always figured it out through some combination of extra shifts and skipped meals and careful negotiation with creditors who were used to people like him, people who were trying, who just didn't have enough to spread across all the cracks in their lives. The soup was ready. He called Maya to dinner. They sat at their small table, another door-on-crate situation, covered with a vinyl tablecloth that Maya had picked out because it had sunflowers on it, and sunflowers were happy. "How was school today?" Ethan asked, which was what fathers were supposed to ask, even when they could guess the answer. "Good. We learned about butterflies." "Did you know they can taste with their feet?" "I did not know that." "It's true. Miss Roberts showed us a video. They land on flowers and can tell if it's good to eat just by standing on it." Maya demonstrated with her hand, landing her fingers on the table like butterfly feet. "Imagine if we could do that. You could just step on your dinner and know if it was good." Ethan smiled despite everything, despite the bills and the exhaustion and the general weight of keeping their small ship afloat. This was why he did it, all of it. These moments. His daughter, enthusiastic about butterflies, unaware that the world was harder than it should be, still young enough to find wonder in simple facts.
They ate Mrs. Chen's soup, chicken and vegetables and rice noodles, simple and perfect, and tasting like someone cared. They talked about butterflies and spelling words and the book they were reading together before bed, a chapter each night, currently in the middle of some story about a mouse who went on adventures that seemed wildly inappropriate for a creature that size. After dinner, Ethan washed dishes while Maya changed into her pajamas. Bath night was every other day. Water was expensive, and anyway, Maya was 6. She wasn't getting that dirty. Teeth brushing was non-negotiable, though, 20 seconds on each quadrant of her mouth, a routine they'd established when her first baby tooth had fallen out, and the dentist had given them the stern talk about cavity prevention. Then the best part of the day? Reading time. Ethan settled into the chair beside Maya's bed, a chair he'd found on the curb 3 blocks away and had carried home on his back, had cleaned until it was safe, had positioned right there so he'd have a place to sit during these nightly rituals. Maya burrowed under her covers, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been hers since birth, that was missing one eye and had been restuffed at least twice but remained her most prized possession. They read Chapter 7, in which the mouse encountered a cat who surprisingly did not want to eat him, but instead wanted his help retrieving something from a high shelf. It was a silly story, implausible on multiple levels, but Maya loved it, and that was enough. After reading, they did their other ritual, 3 good things from the day. "I'll start," Ethan said. 1. Mrs. Chen's soup. 2. Watching you work so hard on your spelling. 3. Right now, this. Maya considered, her face serious. 1. Learning about butterflies. 2. The soup, yeah. 3. When you gave that lady your seat on the train. That was really nice, Daddy. Ethan felt that warm, painful thing in his chest again, that complicated pride-sorrow cocktail. Just trying to do right, sweetheart. I know. That's what makes it nice. He tucked her in, kissed her forehead, turned on the nightlight that cast dancing shapes across the ceiling. Another curb find. This one from 2 years ago, a small lamp shaped like a carousel that Maya had declared the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Love you, Maya bird. Love you, Daddy. He left her door cracked open. She didn't like complete darkness and retreated to the living room. Now came the hard part of the day. The hours between Maya's bedtime and his own, when he had to face the bills and the budget and the impossible mathematics of making not enough stretch across too many needs. Ethan opened his laptop, 7 years old, running an operating system that was 3 versions behind but functional. He pulled up his spreadsheet, the one where he tracked every dollar, every expense, every impossible decision about what got paid and what got pushed to next month. Electric. Couldn't skip that, not with winter coming. Medical, he'd call tomorrow, try to negotiate another payment plan, another extension. School trip. That was the hardest one. He'd have to tell Maya she couldn't go, would have to watch her try to hide her disappointment, would have to feel like he'd failed her even though he was doing everything humanly possible. Unless he picked up extra shifts. The hotel was always looking for people willing to work overnights, the graveyard shift that paid an extra $1.50 an hour. If he could string together 3 or 4 of those next week, on top of his regular schedule, maybe he could scrape together the $45. He'd be exhausted, would barely see Maya, would be running on fumes and coffee and sheer willpower. But she could go on the field trip, could spend a day at the science museum with her class, could experience something beyond their small apartment and the walk to school and the subway rides to nowhere in particular. It was worth it. She was worth it. Ethan added the shifts to his calendar, already feeling the exhaustion they'd bring, already making peace with the cost. This was fatherhood, an endless series of calculations about what you could sacrifice to give your child something approaching normal. He worked on the budget until midnight, moving money around like puzzle pieces, trying to make them fit into a picture that looked like solvency. It never quite worked, but he got close enough. Close enough to keep the lights on, to keep food in the cabinet, to keep them moving forward one day at a time. Finally, exhausted beyond measure, Ethan closed his laptop. He checked on Maya one last time. She was sleeping soundly, her rabbit tucked under her chin, her face peaceful in the way that children's faces were peaceful, unmarked by the worries that carved themselves into adult features. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, just watching her breathe. This was everything. This small person, this beautiful human he'd helped create, this responsibility that was heavier and more precious than anything he'd ever carried. "I'm doing my best," he whispered into the darkness, to Jennifer, to God, to whoever might be listening. "I promise I'm doing my best." The apartment didn't answer. The city rumbled on outside. 8 million people living 8 million lives, most of them struggling in ways large and small, all of them carrying burdens that no one else could see. Ethan went to his own bedroom, set his alarm for 5:30 a.m., lay down on his mattress on the floor. The bed frame had broken a year ago and hadn't been a priority to replace, and closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, the way it always did when your mind wouldn't stop cataloging problems and your body wouldn't stop aching from the day's labor. But eventually, exhaustion won. Eventually, he drifted off into dreams that he wouldn't remember, that featured Jennifer sometimes, her face already starting to blur around the edges, her voice not quite as clear as it used to be. And across the city, in a penthouse in Tribeca, Clara Whitmore stood at her window with a glass of scotch and stared out at the lights, unable to stop thinking about a man who'd given up a seat on a subway train. 2 people, 2 lives, 2 trajectories. Intersecting, the alarm pierced through Ethan's sleep at 5:30 a.m., dragging him from dreams he couldn't remember into a darkness that felt exactly like the one he'd just left. He slapped at his phone until the noise stopped, then lay there for 30 seconds. That was all he allowed himself, 30 seconds to hate the morning before duty kicked in and hauled him to his feet. The apartment was cold. The radiator clanked and hissed but produced more noise than heat, a problem he'd reported to the landlord 6 times, and stopped reporting around time number 4 when it became clear that nothing would change. Ethan pulled on his work clothes in the dark, moving quietly so as not to wake Maya. Jeans worn thin at the knees, a thermal shirt that had been Jennifer's once and still smelled faintly of her lavender detergent if he buried his face in it, which he did sometimes when the missing got too heavy to carry alone. In the bathroom, he splashed water on his face, brushed his teeth, examined the face in the mirror that looked older than its 34 years. His father's eyes stared back at him, brown, deep-set, marked by the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He needed a haircut, needed a lot of things. The haircut would have to wait. By 6 a.m., he was dressed and moving through the apartment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this same routine 1,000 times. He made Maya's lunch first: peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, the last of the string cheese, a handful of pretzels. Packed it in her lunchbox with the cartoon characters on it, added a note on a folded piece of paper. "You're braver than you believe and stronger than you seem. Love, Dad." He wrote her a note every day, even when he was so tired he could barely hold the pen, because Jennifer had done it, and because Maya saved them in a shoebox under her bed, and sometimes he'd find her reading through them like they were precious documents. Coffee next, the cheap stuff that came in a can and tasted like slightly flavored water but had caffeine, which was the only thing that mattered. He drank it black, standing at the kitchen counter, staring at nothing in particular while his brain slowly came online. The door to Maya's room was still cracked open. He could hear her breathing, that soft sound of child sleep that was somehow both fragile and absolute. Mrs. Chen would come up at 7:30 to walk Maya to school, the same arrangement they'd had for 2 years now, an act of kindness that Ethan could never adequately repay, but tried to anyway through small gestures, fixing Mrs. Chen's leaky faucet, carrying her groceries up the stairs, being the kind of neighbor who showed up when called. He left a note for Maya on the kitchen table next to the cereal box and the bowl he'd already set out. "Good morning, Maya Bird. Have a great day at school. I'll be home by dinner. Remember your spelling test? You've got this. Love you more than all the stars." The walk to the subway station was dark and cold, the streets still mostly empty except for the other early risers, delivery trucks, sanitation workers, the night shift stumbling home with dead eyes. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and walked fast, partly for warmth and partly because standing still invited thinking, and thinking at 6:15 a.m. led nowhere good. The subway platform was sparsely populated at this hour, just a handful of people who worked jobs that started before the city properly woke. A nurse still in scrubs, a baker whose hands were dusted with flour, a janitor with a mop bucket on wheels, The tribe of early morning, all of them bound by the shared understanding that the world ran on the labor of people who showed up before dawn. The train arrived and Ethan boarded, found a seat easily, one of the few benefits of the early shift. He sat and let his eyes unfocus, let the rocking motion of the train pull him into that in-between state where you weren't quite awake, but couldn't quite sleep either. 23 minutes later, he emerged at his stop downtown, in the part of the city where the buildings were tall and made of glass and steel, where people wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent, where doormen stood at attention and nobody made eye contact with the maintenance workers. The Grandview Hotel rose 47 stories into the sky, all chrome and marble and understated elegance. Ethan entered through the service entrance on 53rd Street, the one that guests never saw, that led to the warren of hallways and storage rooms and mechanical spaces that made the hotel function. The beautiful lobby with its chandelier and its fresh flowers and its staff who smiled at guests. All of that was a carefully constructed illusion, and the illusion required people like Ethan to maintain it from behind the scenes. He clocked in at 6:47 a.m., 3 minutes early, the way he was always 3 minutes early, and headed to the maintenance office to check the work orders for the day. His supervisor, Rick Moreno, was already there, coffee in hand, looking at a clipboard with the expression of a man who'd been dealing with other people's problems for too long and had run out of patience somewhere around 1997. "Brooks," Rick said, not looking up. "Got a situation on 32. Guest is complaining the shower pressure is weak. Also, ballroom needs the podium fixed before the conference at 9. Also, someone broke the ice machine on 16 again." "Good morning to you too, Rick." Rick finally looked up, his expression flat. "We don't have time for good mornings. We have time for fixing things. You got a problem with that?" Ethan wanted to say yes. He had lots of problems with that. With the way Rick talked to him like he was disposable. With the way the hotel treated its maintenance staff like they were invisible, except when something needed fixing. But he'd learned years ago that talking back didn't change anything except your employment status. And he couldn't afford to lose this job. Couldn't afford the luxury of pride when pride didn't pay for Maya's field trip. "No problem," Ethan said quietly. "I'll start with the shower." He gathered his tools and headed for the service elevator, the one that was slower and older and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. Up to the 32nd floor, where the rooms cost $600 a night and the guests left their towels on the floor because they knew someone else would pick them up. The shower pressure was an easy fix, just a clogged aerator. 10 minutes of work. The guest wasn't in the room, which was a relief. Ethan preferred working when guests weren't around, when he could just do his job without having to navigate the complicated social dynamics of being the help, of being present but not too present, helpful but not too familiar, efficient but invisible. He fixed the shower, tested the pressure, cleaned up after himself. Left the bathroom exactly as he'd found it, except for the now functional shower. Nobody would thank him for this. Nobody would even notice unless he'd failed to fix it. That was the nature of maintenance work. You were only visible when things went wrong. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small repairs and minor emergencies. The podium in the ballroom had a wobbly leg, fixed with some wood glue and a strategic shim. The ice machine had been overfilled and flooded, requiring 20 minutes with a mop and bucket. A toilet on the 18th floor was running, wasting water, the sound of it apparently offensive to a guest who'd left a scathing note at the front desk about the hotel's lack of attention to detail. By noon, Ethan's back ached and his knee throbbed, and he'd consumed enough bad coffee to fuel a small generator. He took his lunch break in the maintenance office, eating the sandwich he'd packed at home. Just peanut butter, the same thing he'd made for Maya, efficiency over variety. Around him, other maintenance workers did the same. A small community of people who kept the hotel running and were rewarded with minimum wage plus $1, no benefits, and the constant awareness that they could be replaced tomorrow. "You look tired, man," said Carlos, one of the other maintenance workers, a guy about Ethan's age with 3 kids and a wife who worked nights at a diner. "You picking up extra shifts again?" "Trying to save up for Maya's school trip." Carlos nodded, the understanding passing between them wordlessly. They were all trying to save up for something: school trips, medical bills, car repairs, the endless parade of expenses that marched through their lives like an occupying army. "My daughter's got a dance recital coming up," Carlos said. "Costume costs $85. $85 for a dress she's going to wear for 20 minutes. But you can't say no, right? Can't be the parent whose kid is the only one not there. Can't say no, Ethan agreed, though the words tasted bitter. Because actually, you could say no. You said no all the time when you were poor. No to new clothes. No to birthday parties that required gifts. No to pizza delivery. No to the movies. No to 1,000 small things that added up to a childhood that was narrower than it should be. The afternoon shift was worse than the morning. Something about the post-lunch slump combined with the accumulation of minor injuries and indignities that came with physical labor. A radiator on the 25th floor was making a noise like a dying animal. A guest had somehow broken the safety latch on their door and was now locked in their room, panicking on the phone to the front desk. A pipe in the basement was leaking, not badly enough to be an emergency, but steadily enough to require attention. Ethan moved through it all with mechanical efficiency, his body on autopilot, his mind mostly elsewhere. Thinking about Maya's spelling test, whether she'd remember to study. Thinking about the electric bill and whether he could negotiate another week. Thinking about nothing in particular, just the static white noise of exhaustion. At 3:30 p.m. his phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Chen. Maya home safe. She got 100 on spelling test. Very proud. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, that constant tension that came with being a single parent, with knowing that your child was out in the world and you couldn't protect them from everything. He texted back, "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You're the best." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "You are good father. She is lucky girl." Ethan stared at those words, feeling them settle somewhere deep. He didn't feel like a good father most days. He felt like someone barely keeping his head above water, constantly one crisis away from drowning. But if Mrs. Chen said it, maybe there was some truth in it. Maybe just showing up every day, just being present and trying, maybe that counted for something. His shift ended at 4 p.m., which meant he could be home by 5 if the subway cooperated. Could have dinner with Maya and hear about her day and help with homework and maintain the small rituals that held their life together. But Rick caught him just as he was clocking out, appeared at his elbow with that expression that meant Ethan's plans were about to change. "Need you to stay late," Rick said, not asking. "Couple hours overtime. We got a VIP guest checking into the penthouse suite, and the fireplace isn't working. Building management wants it fixed before they arrive." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, doing the math. 2 hours overtime meant time and a half, meant extra money he desperately needed. But it also meant not being home for dinner, meant Maya eating with Mrs. Chen instead of him, meant missing bedtime and the reading and the 3 good things. "I need to call my daughter," Ethan said. Rick's expression suggested this was an inconvenience, but he nodded. "Make it quick." Ethan stepped into the hallway, dialed Mrs. Chen's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and slightly out of breath like she'd been moving around. "Mrs. Chen, it's Ethan. I'm so sorry, but I have to work late tonight. Can Maya stay with you for dinner and bedtime? I'll come get her as soon as I'm done." There was no hesitation in Mrs. Chen's response. "Of course, no problem. She can sleep here if you're very late. I have the extra bed." "Thank you. I'll make it up to you, I promise." "You make it up by being good father. That is enough." Ethan hung up and called Maya directly. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright and unburdened. "Hi, Daddy?" "Hey, Maya bird. Listen, I have to work a little late tonight. You're going to have dinner with Mrs. Chen, okay?" The pause on the other end was small but noticeable, disappointment being swallowed before it could voice itself. "Okay. Will you be home to read to me?" "I'll try, sweetheart. If I can't make it, Mrs. Chen will read to you, and I'll read extra tomorrow night. Deal?" "Deal." Her voice was smaller now, but still trying to be brave. 6 years old and already learning to be understanding about broken plans, about the way poverty stole time from families. "I love you more than all the stars," Ethan said. "I love you more than all the stars and the moon and the sun," Maya replied, their familiar call and response. "I'll see you tonight, even if you're already asleep. I'll kiss your forehead and tell you 3 good things, okay?" "Okay, Daddy." They hung up. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment, hating this, hating that he had to choose between money and time, between providing and being present. But there was no real choice, not really. The electric company didn't care about bedtime stories. The school didn't accept apologies instead of $45. He went back to Rick, said he'd stay, and gathered his tools again. The penthouse suite was on the 47th floor, accessed by a private elevator that required a special key. Ethan had only been up here a handful of times in his 2 years at the hotel. These rooms were reserved for the truly wealthy, the kind of people whose names you'd recognize from Forbes lists and gossip columns. The suite was obscene in its luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. A living room larger than Ethan's entire apartment. Furniture that looked like it had been imported from European palaces. A kitchen with appliances so high-tech Ethan wasn't sure how to turn them on. And the fireplace, gas, not wood, set into a marble surround that probably cost more than he'd earn in 5 years. He knelt in front of it, opened the access panel, began diagnosing the problem. The pilot light was out, probably just needed to be relit, but he'd checked the gas line too, make sure there were no leaks, no safety issues. This was the kind of suite where mistakes weren't tolerated, where a missed detail could mean termination. As he worked, Ethan couldn't help but think about the person who'd be staying here. What did you do to earn a life like this? What choices had they made that put them in a penthouse while he was on his knees fixing their fireplace? Was it talent, luck, ruthlessness, inheritance? Some combination of all four? Did they think about people like him at all? Or were maintenance workers just part of the invisible machinery that made their comfortable lives possible? The fireplace was an easy fix, just like the shower that morning. He relit the pilot, tested the ignition, made sure the flames distributed evenly across the ceramic logs. Beautiful, efficient, warm. A luxury that most people would never experience, and the people who did experience it probably took it for granted. By the time Ethan finished and cleaned up and made his way back downstairs, it was nearly 7 p.m. He clocked out, collected his overtime slip, and headed for the subway. The evening train was crowded again, the familiar press of bodies and exhaustion. Ethan found a spot near the door and held the pole and let his mind go blank, too tired to think, too tired to do anything but exist in this small space and count down the stops until he could go home. But as the train rocked and swayed, as the stations passed and the passengers changed, Ethan found his thoughts drifting to yesterday, to the woman he'd given his seat to. He wondered if she'd made it home okay, if that small gesture had mattered at all, or if it had been just another forgettable moment in her day. He'd probably never know. That was how most acts of kindness worked. You put them out into the world, and they disappeared into the great mass of human interaction, and you had to be okay with not knowing if they'd made a difference. The train pulled into 125th Street. Ethan exited, climbed the stairs, walked the 4 blocks home through streets that were darker now, quieter. Everyone already inside having dinner or watching TV or doing the evening things that marked the end of another day. Mrs. Chen's apartment was on the 2nd floor. Ethan knocked softly, and she opened the door with a finger to her lips. "She is sleeping," Mrs. Chen whispered, "but she tried very hard to wait for you." Maya was curled up on Mrs. Chen's couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms, her face peaceful in sleep. Ethan felt his throat tighten at the sight of her, at this small person who deserved so much more than he could give. "Thank you," he whispered to Mrs. Chen. "I'll get her home." He gathered Maya carefully, lifting her the way he'd done when she was a baby, her head falling naturally to his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, just murmured something about butterflies and settled deeper into sleep. Mrs. Chen held the door as he carried Maya up the 2 flights to their apartment, helped him get the door unlocked without waking her. Inside, Ethan laid Maya in her bed, still fully clothed, and pulled the covers over her. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, just watching her breathe, this small miracle that kept him going when everything else felt impossible. 3 good things, he whispered into the quiet. 1, you got 100 on your spelling test. 2, Mrs. Chen taking such good care of you. 3, being here now, even if it's later than I wanted. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the smell of her, strawberry shampoo and the slight sweat of childhood, and something indefinable that was just Maya. In the kitchen, he found a note in Maya's handwriting, careful block letters. "Daddy, Mrs. Chen and me made cookies. There is one for you in the container. I love you. Maya." Ethan opened the container and found a single cookie, slightly misshapen but clearly made with care. He ate it slowly, tasting the sweetness and the love baked into it, and felt tears prick at his eyes because sometimes kindness was the hardest thing to receive. Sometimes being taken care of by a 6-year-old and a 70-year-old woman broke you open in ways that hardship couldn't. He cleaned up the kitchen, did the dishes, checked the calendar for tomorrow's schedule. Another full day, another series of problems to solve and repairs to make, and hours to endure. But also, more time with Maya, more moments of ordinary grace, more opportunities to be the father she deserved, even if he couldn't give her the life she deserved. Ethan finally collapsed into his own bed around 10 p.m., too tired to shower, too tired to do anything but set his alarm and close his eyes. Sleep came quickly this time, pulling him under like a wave, giving him a few hours of oblivion before the alarm would shatter the morning and the whole cycle would begin again. And somewhere across the city, in a neighborhood where the buildings were newer and taller and the streets were cleaner, Clara Whitmore sat in her office on the 38th floor of her company's headquarters and stared at a wall of monitors displaying real-time data from her various business ventures. The numbers were good. They were always good. Clara had built her empire on an uncanny ability to see patterns others missed, to identify opportunities before they became obvious, to execute with precision and without sentiment. She'd started with nothing. That part was true, at least in the way that rich people used the word nothing, which meant middle-class parents and a state school education rather than actual poverty. She'd built her first company at 24, sold it at 27 for 8 figures, then built 3 more companies that were each more successful than the last. Now, at 52, Clara Whitmore was a name that meant something in the business world. She sat on boards. She gave speeches at conferences. She was quoted in the Wall Street Journal and profiled in Fortune and invited to events where the champagne was vintage and the conversation was carefully calibrated to sound casual while actually being intensely strategic. She'd built all of this through sheer force of will and intelligence, and if she was being honest, a certain ruthlessness that came naturally to her. She didn't apologize for it. The business world rewarded decisive action, not hand-wringing. It rewarded results, not intentions. But lately, and she couldn't pinpoint exactly when this had started, Clara had begun to feel a discomfort that she couldn't logic away, a sense that the architecture of her life, so carefully constructed, was somehow hollow at its center. The subway incident yesterday had crystallized something that had been building for months, maybe years. That man giving up his seat, the simplicity of it, the way he'd done it without expecting anything in return, without even seeming to think it remarkable. It had struck her as profoundly foreign, this way of moving through the world. When was the last time she'd done something that wasn't strategic, that wasn't calculated to produce some outcome or maintain some advantage? Clara couldn't remember. Her assistant, Marcus, knocked on her open office door. The quarterly reports are ready for your review. Also, the Times wants to interview you about the new education initiative. What education initiative? The one our PR team announced last week, the Scholarship Fund for Underserved Communities. Clara vaguely remembered signing off on that, one of a dozen initiatives her team had proposed as part of their corporate social responsibility strategy. Good optics, tax deductible, minimal actual involvement required on her part beyond the initial approval. Tell them I'm not available, Clara said. Have someone from the foundation do it. Marcus nodded and retreated. Clara returned her attention to the monitors, but the numbers that usually captivated her now seemed abstract, disconnected from anything real. She thought about the man on the subway, wondered what his life was like, what brought him to that train at that time. He'd had a daughter with him, young, maybe 6 or 7. They'd moved with the easy coordination of people who'd developed routines out of necessity, who'd learned to navigate a difficult world together. What did that feel like, Clara wondered? To have someone depend on you that completely. To build a life around care rather than acquisition. She'd never had children, had never wanted them, or at least had told herself she didn't want them, which amounted to the same thing after a certain point. Her companies were her legacy. Her empire was her offspring. She'd built something that would outlast her, that would bear her name long after she was gone. But would anyone miss her? Would anyone remember her as someone who'd made their life better in some small human way? The thought was unwelcome, almost frightening in its implications. Clara pushed back from her desk, poured herself 2 fingers of the scotch she kept in her office for late nights and difficult decisions, and stood at her window looking out over the city. Somewhere down there, in those thousands of buildings, millions of people were living lives she couldn't imagine. Getting up early to work jobs that didn't pay enough, raising children in apartments that were too small, making impossible choices about which bills to pay and which to let slide, giving up subway seats without thinking twice about it. Clara had insulated herself from that world so thoroughly that it might as well not exist. She hadn't ridden public transit in years except for yesterday, when her car service had canceled last minute and she'd been running late. She didn't know what groceries cost, didn't know what rent was like in normal neighborhoods, didn't know the small mathematics of scarcity that governed most people's lives. She'd thought this distance was a good thing, evidence of her success. Now she wondered if it was evidence of something else entirely. Her phone buzzed with a text from her executive assistant. Reminder, gala tomorrow night. Car will pick you up at 7. Right, the annual charity gala, the one where wealthy people paid $5,000 a plate to feel good about themselves while eating mediocre chicken and listening to speeches about making a difference. Clara had sponsored a table, would attend because it was expected, would write a check large enough to be noticed, but not so large that it impacted her bottom line. It was all performance, she realized. All of it. The gala, the scholarship fund, the speeches about giving back. None of it required her to actually engage with the problems she claimed to care about. None of it brought her into contact with the people she was supposedly helping. None of it looked anything like a man giving up his subway seat because someone else needed it more. Clara finished her scotch and made a decision, the kind of snap decision she usually reserved for business opportunities. She was going to find that man. Not to thank him, that felt insufficient, almost insulting, but to understand him, to see what a life built on kindness rather than calculation actually looked like. She opened her laptop and began searching through subway surveillance footage. A breach of privacy she justified to herself as research, as trying to understand something important. It took 3 hours and several phone calls to people who owed her favors, but eventually she had what she needed: a partial face, a location, a rough trajectory. It wasn't much, but Clara Whitmore had built an empire on less. She'd find him, would figure out his story, would... What? She wasn't entirely sure, but for the first time in years she felt something like genuine curiosity rather than strategic interest. By the time Clara left her office, it was nearly midnight. The city was quieter now, the streets mostly empty except for late-night workers and people who had nowhere else to be. Her driver took her home to her penthouse in Tribeca, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that had been featured in design magazines and silence so complete it felt like a presence. She poured another scotch, stood at those windows, and looked out at the city she'd conquered. Down there somewhere, a man was probably asleep in an apartment she couldn't imagine, dreaming dreams she couldn't fathom, living a life that had somehow become more interesting to her than her own. Clara raised her glass to the distant lights, to the anonymous millions living their complicated lives, to the man who'd given up his seat and unknowingly cracked something open in her carefully constructed world. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know that he was called Ethan Brooks, that he had a daughter named Maya, that he worked maintenance at a hotel she probably stayed at sometimes without noticing the people who made her comfort possible. She didn't know that her curiosity was about to change both their lives in ways neither of them could anticipate, that good intentions could become their own kind of violence, that the distance between helping and controlling was smaller and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. All she knew, standing there in her expensive silence, was that something had shifted. The numbers on her monitors no longer felt like enough. The empire she'd built no longer felt like justification for the emptiness at its center. And somewhere in that realization was the seed of everything that would come next. The mistakes and the reckonings and the slow, painful discovery that power without wisdom was just another form of poverty. 3 weeks passed before Clara made her move. 3 weeks during which she assembled information the way other people collected stamps. She learned Ethan's name through hotel employment records, a simple phone call to her assistant who knew someone on the Grandview's management team, who pulled the maintenance roster without asking why. She learned about Maya through school enrollment databases that shouldn't have been accessible but were, if you knew the right people and had the right leverage. She learned about Jennifer's death through public records, about the medical debt through credit reports that cost $500 to access illegally, and nothing to her conscience because she told herself she was trying to help. By the end of those 3 weeks, Clara knew more about Ethan Brooks than most of his neighbors did. She knew he worked 50-hour weeks at slightly above minimum wage. She knew his rent was 2 months behind, kept current only through negotiations with a landlord who was more patient than most. She knew about the electric bill threatening disconnection, about the medical debt that had ballooned to $47,000, about the fact that Maya's school had a payment plan for families in need, and Ethan had signed up for it, paying $30 a month toward a balance that never seemed to decrease. What Clara didn't know, what all her research and money and access couldn't tell her, was what it felt like to live that life, to make those choices, to measure every decision against a scarcity so total that a $45 field trip became a mathematical problem requiring overtime and sacrifice. She thought she was learning about him. She was really just collecting data, and data without context was just another form of blindness. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Ethan was replacing a heating element in a commercial oven in the hotel's kitchen. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an unfamiliar number with a Manhattan area code. He almost didn't answer. Telemarketers and debt collectors were the usual source of unknown numbers, but something made him wipe his hands on his work pants and pick up. "Mr. Brooks?" The voice was female, professional, calibrated to sound friendly without actually being warm. "This is Jennifer Hastings from the Educational Advancement Foundation. Do you have a moment?" Ethan's first thought was that Maya had done something wrong at school, that this was some kind of formal notification. His stomach clenched. "Is my daughter okay?" "Oh yes, she's fine. This is actually about a wonderful opportunity. The foundation has selected Maya to receive a full scholarship for the remainder of her elementary education, covering all fees, supplies, and extracurricular activities. We were hoping to schedule a time to discuss the details with you." The words didn't make sense at first, like they were in the wrong order or a different language. Ethan set down his tools, moved out of the kitchen's noise, into the relative quiet of the service hallway. "I'm sorry, what?" Jennifer Hastings repeated herself with the patience of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news to people who couldn't process it. "A scholarship, full coverage. Maya had been selected through a review process that evaluated both need and merit. And congratulations, Mr. Brooks. Your daughter's future just got significantly brighter." "I don't understand," Ethan said slowly. "Maya's 6. She's in 1st grade." "What merit review?" "The foundation uses a comprehensive evaluation system," Jennifer explained, her tone suggesting she'd answered this question before and had a script prepared. "We look at academic potential, family circumstances, and other factors. Maya showed exceptional promise, and your family's situation qualified you for our assistance program." Red flags were waving in Ethan's mind, but they were competing with a desperate hope that made it hard to think clearly. This could solve everything. The field trip, the summer program Maya had mentioned, the math tutoring the teacher had suggested, but that cost $60 an hour. All of it. Just handled. "What's the catch?" Ethan asked, because there was always a catch, because nothing good came free, because he'd learned that lesson too many times to forget it now. "No catch," Jennifer said warmly. "The foundation is funded by private donors who believe in investing in promising young students. All we need is your signature on some paperwork, and Maya's covered through 5th grade." Ethan wanted to believe it, wanted it so badly that his chest hurt. But the voice in his head, the one that sounded like his father, pragmatic and suspicious, kept asking questions. Why Maya? Why now? Who were these donors, and what did they actually want? "Can I think about it?" Ethan asked. There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. "Of course. Though I should mention that the foundation has limited resources, and if you decline, the scholarship would go to another deserving student. We'd need your answer by Friday." The manufactured scarcity wasn't lost on Ethan. He'd seen enough sales tactics to recognize one, but it worked anyway because the stakes were Maya's education, Maya's future, Maya's chance at something better than the life he could provide alone. "I'll call you back by Friday," Ethan said, and ended the call before he could be convinced of anything else. The rest of his shift passed in a fog. He went through the motions, fixed the oven, unclogged a drain, replaced light bulbs in the lobby,
but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the scholarship offer like a Rubik's Cube he couldn't solve. It felt wrong somehow, but he couldn't articulate why. And maybe that was just his pride talking, his resistance to accepting help, even when help was desperately needed. That evening, after Maya was asleep, Ethan called the only person he trusted to give him straight advice, his brother Marcus, who lived in Philadelphia and worked as a paralegal and had always been better at seeing angles that Ethan missed. "It's probably legit," Marcus said after Ethan explained the situation. "There are foundations like this, wealthy people who want tax write-offs for charity. But here's what you do. You Google them, check their registration, see if they're a real nonprofit. Ask for references from other families they've helped. Don't sign anything until you've read every word, and I mean every word, of the contract." "You think it could be some kind of scam?" "I think free money is never actually free," Marcus said. "Either they want something from you, or they want to feel good about themselves, or both. Doesn't mean you shouldn't take it, but go in with your eyes open." That night, Ethan sat at his laptop and searched for the Educational Advancement Foundation. They had a professional website, a listed address in Midtown, testimonials from other families. Everything looked legitimate, but something still nagged at him, some instinct he couldn't name. He was still researching when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Brooks, this is Clara Whitmore. I'm the primary donor for the foundation. I'd like to meet with you personally to discuss Maya's scholarship. Would you be available Thursday evening?" Ethan stared at the message, that nagging feeling crystallizing into something sharper. Clara Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him, but a quick search revealed everything. Billionaire entrepreneur, CEO of multiple companies, philanthropist, and now, apparently, personally invested in his daughter's education. "Why?" He texted back. "Why does a billionaire care about my daughter?" The response came quickly. "Because someone once showed me kindness when I needed it, and I'd like to pay it forward. Thursday, 7 p.m. at the Northside Diner on 125th, my treat." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. The diner was 2 blocks from his apartment. She knew where he lived, knew his schedule well enough to suggest a time after his shift ended. This wasn't random. This wasn't some bureaucratic foundation making impersonal decisions based on merit reviews. This was personal, and he didn't understand why, and that scared him more than the debt or the disconnection notices or any of the other crises he'd learned to navigate. But he texted back, "I'll be there." Because he needed to know, because Maya's future hung in the balance, because sometimes you had to walk into situations that felt wrong to find out if they actually were. Thursday came faster than Ethan wanted it to. He worked his regular shift, came home to have dinner with Maya, helped her with homework, a worksheet about addition that she completed with the focused intensity of someone who took education seriously because her father had taught her it mattered. After she was asleep, after Mrs. Chen had agreed to check on her while he was gone, Ethan walked the 2 blocks to the Northside Diner with his hands shoved in his pockets and his mind running through scenarios. The diner was a neighborhood institution, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, and the waitresses knew everyone's order, and the booths were cracked vinyl held together with duct tape. It was emphatically not the kind of place where billionaires usually ate, which was probably the point. Clara Whitmore sat in a corner booth, visible through the window before Ethan even entered. She was smaller than he'd expected from her photos online, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater that probably cost more than his monthly rent, but didn't advertise it. Her hair was pulled back, her face free of makeup, her expression carefully neutral. She saw him approaching and stood, extending her hand. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for meeting me." Ethan shook her hand briefly, slid into the booth across from her. "Let's skip the pleasantries. Why are you doing this?" Clara's composure flickered, just for a second, surprise at his directness. Then she smiled slightly. "You don't remember me, do you?" "Should I?" 3 weeks ago. Subway, evening commute. You gave up your seat for me." The memory surfaced slowly, the tired woman, the small gesture he'd already forgotten about. Ethan stared at her, pieces clicking into place. "That was you. That was me. And now you're trying to give my daughter a scholarship because I gave you a seat on a train. When you put it that way, it sounds transactional. I prefer to think of it as recognizing kindness and wanting to amplify it." Ethan felt anger rising, hot and sharp. "You investigated me.
You found out where I work, where I live, where my daughter goes to school. You dug into my finances, my debts, my whole life. And you did all of that without asking, without permission, because you decided you knew what I needed. Claire's expression shifted, defensiveness creeping in. I was trying to help. Help. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but intense. You want to help? Let me tell you what help actually looks like. Help is Mrs. Chen walking my daughter to school because I have to work early. Help is Carlos lending me $20 when I'm short on groceries. Help is the librarian who lets Maya stay an extra hour after closing because she loves to read and we don't have books at home. Help is people who see me as a person, not a project. I didn't mean you investigated me like I was some kind of business acquisition, Ethan continued, his anger sharpening his words. You made decisions about my daughter's life without asking what I wanted, what I needed, what would actually be helpful. You put me in a position where saying no means taking opportunity away from Maya, which means you've stripped away my ability to make choices about my own family. Claire's face had gone pale. I thought I was doing something good. Good for who? Ethan asked. Good for Maya or good for you? Does this make you feel better about your wealth? Does it help you sleep at night, knowing you swooped in to save the poor maintenance worker? That's not fair. Fair? Ethan's laugh was bitter. You want to talk about fair? I work 50 hours a week and can barely keep the lights on. I have a daughter who's brilliant and kind and deserves every opportunity in the world, and I can't give them to her, no matter how hard I try. That's not fair. But you know what? I've made my peace with it, because that's my reality. What I can't make peace with is someone treating my family like a charity case without having the decency to ask if we want to be one. They sat in silence for a moment. The diner's ambient noise, clinking dishes, conversation, the hiss of the grill, filling the space between them. Clara looked shaken, her carefully constructed plans colliding with a reality she hadn't anticipated. You're right, she said finally, her voice quieter. I overstepped. I thought that having resources meant I should use them to help, but I didn't stop to consider how it would feel from your perspective. I didn't ask. I just decided. So withdraw the scholarship, Ethan said. Clara met his eyes. I can't do that. Why not? Because despite everything I've done wrong in how I offered it, Maya still deserves those opportunities. The scholarship is real, the funding is there, and turning it down because I made mistakes in delivery would only hurt her. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to refuse on principle, but she was right, and he hated that she was right. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford when the cost was Maya's education. Let me ask you something, Ethan said. If I accept this, what do you get out of it? Clara considered the question, seemed to be genuinely thinking about it rather than producing a prepared answer. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe absolution, maybe the feeling that my money is doing something that actually matters instead of just accumulating. Maybe proof that I'm not as disconnected from basic human decency as I've become. The honesty was unexpected, almost disarming. Ethan studied her face, seeing past the careful composure to something more fragile underneath. She was lost, he realized, rich beyond measure, but lost in a way that money couldn't fix. I don't want to be your redemption project, Ethan said. I know. And I don't want Maya learning that opportunities come from strangers who feel guilty rather than from her own merit and hard work. I understand. But I also can't turn down something that could change her life because of my ego. Clara nodded slowly. So what do you want? If you could design this however you wanted, what would help actually look like? The question caught Ethan off guard. Nobody had ever asked him that before. What he wanted, how he'd solve his own problems if he had the resources. He thought about it, really thought about it, while Clara waited. Transparency, Ethan said finally. No more investigating me behind my back, no more surprises. If you're going to be involved in my daughter's life, we establish boundaries and expectations up front. Agreed. And this isn't about you feeling good. This is about Maya getting what she needs to succeed, which means I get to decide what that is, and you provide support without control. That's reasonable. And one more thing, Ethan said, leaning back in the booth. You want to help? Really help? Then help everyone. Because there are 50 kids in Maya's school who need what she needs. There are families in my building struggling just as hard. You want redemption or absolution or whatever you're looking for? It doesn't come from saving one kid. It comes from fixing the systems that make it necessary to save anyone at all. Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing this. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. You're asking me to do more than write a check. I'm asking you to give a damn about the problem, not just the solution that makes you feel good. That's a bigger commitment than a scholarship. Then maybe you shouldn't have started this, Ethan said. They stared at each other across the worn diner table. Two people from completely different worlds, connected by a moment on a subway train that had seemed insignificant at the time. The waitress came by, refilled Clara's coffee, asked if they wanted anything else. Ethan ordered a coffee he didn't want just to give his hand something to do. I need to think about this, Clara said finally. Not the scholarship, that's yours, no conditions, if you want it, but the bigger picture you're painting. I've spent my career believing that efficiency and scale were the answers to everything. You're suggesting something that requires actual engagement, actual understanding, actual presence in communities I've never been part of. I'm suggesting you can't buy your way out of being human, Ethan said. Money's a tool, but it's not a substitute for actually showing up, for actually listening to what people need rather than deciding for them. Claire's phone buzzed on the table between them. She glanced at it, probably some business emergency that would normally command her immediate attention, and turned it face down without responding. The gesture felt significant, a small choosing of this conversation over whatever empire-managing crisis was waiting. Tell me about Maya, Clara said. Not the file I read about her grades and her school. Tell me who she is. It was a peace offering, Ethan recognized, an attempt to do what he'd asked, to see them as people rather than problems to be solved. He could refuse, could walk out of this diner and this uncomfortable conversation and maybe save his pride but lose the opportunity. Or he could try, could meet this flawed gesture halfway and see if something better than its beginning could grow from it. She's 6, Ethan started slowly. She counts everything, stairs, cracks in the sidewalk, how many peas are on her plate. She's obsessed with butterflies right now, keeps drawing them in the margins of her homework. She's terrified of thunderstorms, but pretends she's not because she thinks it makes me worry. She asks questions about her mother sometimes, and I try to answer honestly, even when it breaks my heart. She's the best thing I've ever done, the only thing I've done that actually matters. Clara listened without interrupting, and Ethan found himself continuing, talking about Maya's gap-toothed smile and her fierce loyalty to her stuffed rabbit and the way she hummed when she was concentrating. He talked about the daycare teacher who'd told him Maya was gifted, which he'd known already, but hearing it confirmed had made him cry in his car afterward, because it meant his daughter had potential he might not be able to nurture properly. When he finally stopped, Claire's expression had shifted into something softer, more genuine. She sounds remarkable, Clara said quietly, and it's clear she has a remarkable father. I'm just trying not to mess her up too badly. That's what good parents do. They worry about that. Bad parents never question themselves. They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually losing its sharp edges as they found unexpected common ground. Clara talked about her own childhood, middle class but comfortable, parents who'd believed in education and hard work. She talked about building her first company in her 20s, the 100-hour weeks and the fear of failure, and the slow realization that success hadn't brought the satisfaction she'd expected. I thought if I made enough money, earned enough respect, built something big enough, I'd feel... She trailed off, searching for words. I don't know, complete. But mostly I just feel isolated. Everyone wants something from me, my money, my influence, my endorsement. Nobody just wants to have coffee and talk about their kid. That's because you've constructed your life to make that impossible, Ethan said. You've surrounded yourself with people who see you as Clara Whitmore, billionaire. When was the last time someone was allowed to just see you as Clara? She couldn't answer that question, and her inability to answer was its own response. They parted around 9:30, stepping out into the November cold that bit at exposed skin and turned breath visible. Clara's car was parked down the block, sleek, black, expensive, but understated. Ethan would walk home. So, Clara said, shoving her hands in her pockets, The scholarship, yes or no? Ethan took a breath, made the decision he'd already known he'd make. Yes, but on the terms we discussed, transparency, no control, and you think about the bigger picture. Deal. Clara extended her hand, and this time when Ethan shook it, it felt less like a business transaction and more like the beginning of something he couldn't quite name yet. One more thing, Ethan said. Maya knows I'm meeting with someone about school funding. She's going to want to meet you to say thank you because that's how I'm raising her. You up for that? Clara looked genuinely nervous for the first time that evening. I've never been good with children. You just have to show up and be honest. Kids have excellent radar for bullshit. That's what I'm afraid of. Despite everything, Ethan smiled. Saturday morning, 10 a.m. The playground on 126th. Bring coffee, not gifts, and be prepared to answer questions about butterflies. Clara nodded, looking like she'd just agreed to face a boardroom full of hostile investors. Saturday, 10 a.m., butterflies. Got it. She drove away, leaving Ethan standing on the sidewalk, watching her taillights disappear into traffic. He felt exhausted, but also strangely energized, like he'd survived something dangerous and come out the other side changed. He'd stood his ground, had refused to be diminished by someone else's charity, had demanded to be seen as a person rather than a problem. And somehow, impossibly, she'd listened. The walk home took 10 minutes, but Ethan's mind was already jumping ahead to Saturday, to explaining this to Maya in a way that preserved both her excitement and his boundaries. To introducing his daughter to a woman who could change their lives, but only if she learned to do it the right way. Mrs. Chen was watching TV in her apartment. Door cracked open the way she always kept it when watching Maya. She saw Ethan pass and called out softly, "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Ethan said, stopping at her doorway. "Everything's complicated, but okay." "Complicated can be good," Mrs. Chen said with the wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to know that simple was overrated. Simple usually means nothing is changing. "When did you get so philosophical?" "Same time you got so stubborn." She smiled at him, affection warming her lined face. "Maya had good evening. We made flashcards for her spelling test. She is sleeping since 8 o'clock. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You would find a way," she said simply. "That is what good parents do. But it's nice you do not have to find out." Upstairs, Ethan checked on Maya, still sleeping soundly, rabbit clutched close, and then collapsed on his own bed with his clothes still on. He should shower, should prepare tomorrow's lunches, should do all the small maintenance tasks that kept their life running. Instead, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, processing the evening's conversation and its implications. He'd accepted help. He'd set boundaries. He'd demanded respect and somehow received it. In the morning, he'd have to figure out what came next. How to navigate this strange new relationship with a woman who had more money than he could conceptualize, but less understanding of basic human connection than Maya did. But for now, in this moment, Ethan let himself feel something he hadn't felt in years. Cautious hope. Not that everything would suddenly be easy, not that money would solve their problems, but hope that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to do this alone anymore. That accepting help didn't mean surrendering dignity, that somewhere between his pride and Clara's wealth, they might find a way forward that honored both their humanity. It was a fragile feeling, easily broken, but it was real. And real was enough to build on, even if the foundation was still shaky. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of November day where the sun looked warm but the air had teeth. Ethan woke at his usual time despite not needing to work, that internal alarm clock that wouldn't shut off even when given permission. He made pancakes for Maya, just Bisquick and water, nothing fancy, but she loved them anyway, drowning them in the cheap syrup that came in a plastic bottle shaped like a cabin. "So remember what I told you," Ethan said as Maya chewed enthusiastically, syrup on her chin. "We're meeting a friend at the playground this morning. Her name is Ms. Clara, and she's helping with some of your school costs." Maya swallowed, her expression serious. "Like the field trip?" "Like the field trip and other things too, books and supplies and activities." "Why?" It was the question Ethan had been dreading because he didn't have a good answer, at least not one that made sense to a 6-year-old. Because a stranger felt guilty? Because wealth created obligations that money tried to satisfy? Because kindness and control were sometimes hard to tell apart? Because sometimes people who have more than they need want to help people who need more than they have, Ethan said carefully. And as long as it's done with respect, it's okay to accept help. Maya considered this while she cut another piece of pancake. Is she nice? I think she's trying to be. That's different from being nice. Out of the mouths of children, Ethan thought. Yeah, Maya Bird, it is different, but trying is how people become nice, so we're going to give her a chance, okay? Okay, can I bring my butterfly drawings to show her? Absolutely. They arrived at the playground at 9:55, 5 minutes early because Ethan was pathologically incapable of being late to anything. The park was busy with weekend traffic, kids shrieking on the jungle gym, parents clustered in conversation groups, the familiar chaos of neighborhood life on a Saturday morning. Ethan spotted Clara immediately, sitting on a bench at the edge of the playground, 2 coffee cups beside her, looking profoundly out of place in designer jeans and cashmere. That's her, Ethan said quietly to Maya. Remember your manners. They walked over, and Clara stood as they approached, her nervousness visible in the way she clutched her coffee cup a little too tightly. Up close, without the armor of her office or even the neutral ground of the diner, she looked younger somehow, more uncertain. Ms. Clara? Maya said, because Ethan had taught her to introduce herself properly. I'm Maya Brooks. Thank you for helping with my school. Clara blinked, clearly not expecting such direct courtesy from a 6-year-old. You're welcome, Maya. It's nice to meet you. I brought drawings, Maya announced, pulling her folder from her backpack. Daddy said you might want to see my butterfly pictures. I would love to see them. They sat on the bench, Maya between the 2 adults, and she proceeded to give Clara a detailed tour of her butterfly portfolio. There were 8 drawings, each one carefully labeled with the butterfly's name and colors, some of which were real species, and some of which Maya had invented. Clara listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions about wing patterns and habitats, and Ethan felt some of his tension ease. This one's my favorite, Maya said, pointing to a drawing of a monarch. They migrate thousands of miles, did you know? All the way to Mexico. Miss Roberts said they're like tiny adventurers. That's remarkable, Clara said. Do you want to be an adventurer when you grow up? Maya thought about this seriously. I want to be a scientist who studies butterflies, but also maybe a teacher or someone who helps people. I haven't decided yet. You have time to figure it out. That's what Daddy says. Maya looked at her father with complete trust. He says I can be anything I work hard enough to become. Clara's expression shifted, something complicated passing across her face. Your dad's right, and he's doing an excellent job raising you. I know, Maya said simply. He's the best dad in the world. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He'd spent years wondering if he was enough, if his best was anywhere near good enough, if Maya would grow up resenting what he couldn't provide. But here she was, 6 years old and absolutely certain of his worth, and it was almost too much to bear. Hey, Maya Bird, Ethan said, his voice slightly rough. Why don't you go play for a bit while Ms. Clara and I talk? Stay where I can see you, okay? Okay. Maya gathered her drawings, gave Clara a smile that was pure sunshine, and ran off toward the swings. For a moment, neither adult spoke. They just watched Maya pump her legs, gaining height, her laughter carrying across the playground. She's extraordinary, Clara said finally. Yeah, she is. And you're doing it alone. Not entirely alone. I've got Mrs. Chen and Carlos at work, and the librarian who lets Maya stay late. It takes a village, like they say. Ethan paused. But, yeah, mostly it's just us. Clara handed him one of the coffee cups. Good coffee, he noticed, from one of those expensive cafes where a small costs $6. I spent the last 2 days thinking about what you said, about helping everyone, not just one kid, about fixing systems instead of just treating symptoms. And I think you're right, but I have no idea how to actually do that. Clara turned to face him, her expression more open than it had been at the diner. I know how to build companies, how to read markets, how to make money efficiently. I don't know how to help communities. I don't know what people actually need versus what I think they need. Every time I've tried to do philanthropic work, it's been from a distance. Write a check, attend a gala, approve a grant proposal, never getting my hands dirty, never really engaging. So engage, Ethan said. How? Ethan sipped his expensive coffee, watching Maya share the swings with another little girl, the two of them taking turns pushing each other. You want the honest answer? You shut up and listen. You don't come in with solutions already figured out. You don't assume you know better because you're rich. You sit down with people who are living these problems every day, and you ask them what would actually help, and then you believe them when they tell you. That's harder than it sounds. Everything worth doing is harder than it sounds. Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, I want to do something real. Not just fund a scholarship program. That's important, but it's still me operating from a distance. I want to build something that actually changes the equation for families like yours. Like mine, Ethan repeated, testing the phrase. You mean poor families? I mean families where hard work isn't enough, where parents are doing everything right and still can't get ahead because the system is rigged against them. It was a more honest acknowledgement than Ethan had expected. Okay, so what are you proposing? Clara took a breath, and Ethan recognized the look on her face. It was the same expression Maya got when she was about to suggest something she wasn't sure would be well received. I want to start a community support program. Real support, not just financial. Childcare assistance, job training, housing advocacy, help navigating systems like healthcare and education. I want to hire people who actually know these communities to run it, and I want you to help me build it. Ethan stared at her. Me? You know what people need because you're living it. You know what actually helps versus what sounds good on paper. You've got credibility in your community that I'll never have. And you're not afraid to tell me when I'm wrong, which is apparently something I desperately need. I'm a maintenance worker, Clara. I don't know anything about running programs or managing budgets or... You know about living on the edge of financial collapse and still managing to raise a remarkable kid, Clara interrupted. You know about navigating systems designed to keep people down. You know about community because you're part of one, not observing it from a penthouse. That's the expertise this needs. Ethan felt dizzy, like the playground was tilting beneath him. This wasn't what he'd expected. A scholarship, yes, maybe some ongoing financial help. But this was asking him to step into a completely different role, to become something other than the maintenance worker struggling to survive. I can't just quit my job, Ethan said. I have bills, responsibilities. Maya depends on... I'm offering you a job, Clara said. A real job, with a salary that would let you stop working 70 hours a week. Benefits, including health care that would help with your medical debt. Enough that you could breathe, maybe for the first time since your wife died. The mention of Jennifer hit Ethan like a physical blow. Clara must have seen it in his face because she winced. I'm sorry, that was... No, Ethan said quietly. It's true. I haven't been able to breathe in 3 years. I've been in survival mode so long I don't remember what normal feels like. So let me help make it possible for you to remember. Ethan watched Maya on the swings, her joy uncomplicated and pure. What would it mean for her if he took this job? More time together, certainly. Less exhaustion, less stress radiating from him that she absorbed even when he tried to hide it. The ability to say yes to field trips and birthday parties and all the small things he currently had to carefully ration. But also working with Clara, whose intentions were good but whose understanding was limited. Becoming the face of her charity, the example she'd point to as proof of her program's worth. Trading one kind of dependence for another, one set of constraints for a different set. What would the job actually be? Ethan asked. Clara shifted on the bench, and Ethan could see her moving into business mode, the place where she felt most confident. Community program director. You'd be responsible for understanding needs, building relationships, connecting families to resources. You'd hire and manage staff, people with lived experience, not just social work degrees. You'd have real authority to make decisions about how money gets spent and what services get prioritized. And you'd keep me honest, make sure we're actually helping rather than just making ourselves feel good. What's the salary? $65,000 to start, negotiable upward based on performance and program growth. Full benefits, 2 weeks vacation, normal 40-hour work week unless there's a crisis. $65,000. Ethan made $32,000 at the hotel before taxes. This would more than double his income, would move them from barely surviving to actually stable. It would mean Maya could have new shoes when she needed them instead of when the old ones literally fell apart. It would mean he could fix his car instead of relying on the subway. It would mean breathing room, margin, the ability to plan more than a week ahead. It was also terrifying. I don't have the qualifications, Ethan said. I barely finished community college before Jennifer got pregnant. I don't have a degree in social work or nonprofit management or whatever you're supposed to have for this kind of position. You have something better. You have authenticity and lived experience, Clara countered. Yes, we'll need some people with formal training on staff, but the person leading this program needs to have credibility with the community it's serving. That's you, not some 25-year-old with a master's degree who's never missed a meal. Ethan wanted to argue, but he couldn't quite form the objection, because she was right in a way that made him uncomfortable. He knew these streets, knew these struggles, knew the difference between help that actually helped and help that just made helpers feel good. What if I'm terrible at it? Ethan asked. Then we figure it out together, Clara said. Look, I'm not pretending this is simple or that you'll just magically know everything. There'll be a learning curve. But I'd rather work with someone who genuinely cares and has to learn the technical stuff than someone who has all the credentials but no real understanding. Maya ran back over, slightly out of breath, her cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. Daddy, can we go to the library after this? I finished all my books. Sure, sweetheart. Ethan looked at Clara. I need time to think about this. It's a big decision. I know, take whatever time you need. Clara stood, prepared to leave, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? Why'd you give up that seat on the subway? You had your daughter with you. You'd probably been on your feet all day. You had as much right to it as I did. Ethan considered the question. Because you needed it more. And because that's what you do, if you want to live in a world where people take care of each other. You can't wait for someone else to start being kind. You just have to do it and hope it spreads. Does it spread? Sometimes. Not as often as it should, but enough to keep trying. Clara nodded slowly, and Ethan saw her absorbing this, trying to fit it into her worldview that had been built on competition and individual achievement. I'll call you Monday, she said. If you want to talk more, ask questions, whatever you need. Okay. Clara crouched down to Maya's level. Thank you for showing me your butterfly drawings, Maya. They were beautiful. You're welcome. Are you going to be Daddy's friend? The question was so direct, so innocent, that Clara seemed momentarily lost. I hope so, she said finally. If he'll let me. You should, Maya said seriously. He needs more friends. He's lonely sometimes, even though he doesn't say it. Ethan felt his face heat. Maya, it's true, Daddy. I hear you sometimes at night when you think I'm sleeping. You talk to Mom's picture. The air seemed to leave Ethan's lungs. He hadn't known Maya was aware of those moments, those late nights, when the grief got too heavy, and he'd pull out the photo album and have one-sided conversations with Jennifer about whether he was doing okay, whether she'd be proud of how he was raising their daughter, whether he was allowed to feel anything other than tired and determined. Clara's expression had softened into something almost painful to look at, empathy so raw it was nearly naked. I should go, she said quietly. Let you two get to the library. She walked away toward her car, and Ethan watched her go, feeling like something fundamental had shifted, but not quite able to name what it was. Did I say something wrong? Maya asked, picking up on his silence. No, baby, you just said something true, which is always right, even when it's hard. They walked to the library, Maya's hand in his, her chatter about books and butterflies washing over him while his mind spun through possibilities and fears. That evening, after Maya was asleep, Ethan called Marcus. She offered you what? Marcus said, and Ethan could hear him sitting up, giving this his full attention. A job running a community support program. $65,000 a year. Marcus was quiet for a beat. That's more than double what you make now. I know. And you're hesitating because I don't know if I can do it. Because it feels like charity dressed up as employment, because I'm scared of depending on her and then having her decide this whole project was a mistake. Those are all valid concerns, Marcus said carefully. But let me ask you this. If someone else offered you the same job, same salary, same responsibilities, would you hesitate? Ethan thought about it. Probably not. So the issue isn't the job itself. It's that it's coming from her, from this complicated situation you're in where you can't tell where help ends and control begins. Yeah. Okay. So here's what you do. You set very clear boundaries. You get everything in writing. You establish what success looks like, what your actual authority is. What happens if it doesn't work out? You treat this like any other job, with expectations and accountability on both sides. And if she's genuine about respecting you, she'll appreciate that approach. It was good advice, pragmatic and clear, exactly what Ethan needed to hear. They talked for another 20 minutes, Marcus helping him think through questions to ask, terms to negotiate, ways to protect himself and Maya if this went sideways. After hanging up, Ethan opened his laptop and started making notes. If he was going to do this, he'd do it right, as a professional taking a position, not as a charity case accepting handouts. Clara had said she wanted him to keep her honest, wanted his authentic perspective. Fine. He'd give it to her, starting with establishing a relationship built on mutual respect rather than gratitude and guilt. Monday morning, Ethan called Clara from his lunch break. "I want to talk more about the job," he said without preamble, "but I have conditions." "I'm listening." "First, this is employment, not charity. I want a formal contract with clear responsibilities and performance metrics. Second, I want input into the program design before we launch anything. No decisions made without consulting the people we're supposedly helping. Third, I want the authority to hire my own team without you overriding my choices. And fourth, if this doesn't work out for any reason, I want 6 months severance so I'm not left completely hanging." There was a pause on the other end, and Ethan braced himself for pushback. Instead, Clara said, "Those are all reasonable requests. I'll have my attorney draw up a contract with those terms. Anything else?" "Yeah. I want your personal commitment that you'll listen when I tell you something isn't working, even if it contradicts what you think should work. This program lives or dies on whether it's actually meeting needs versus meeting your expectations." "You have that commitment." "Okay then." Ethan took a breath. "When do we start?" "How about next Monday? That gives you time to give notice at the hotel and figure out childcare logistics." "Next Monday," Ethan agreed and ended the call before he could second-guess himself. The next week passed in a blur of logistics and anxiety. Giving notice to Rick was simultaneously satisfying and terrifying. Satisfying because he got to watch Rick's face when he said he'd found a better opportunity. Terrifying because it made this decision real and irreversible. His coworkers threw him an impromptu lunch on his last day, just sandwiches from the deli down the street. But Carlos gave a speech about how Ethan deserved good things, and everyone clapped, and Ethan had to excuse himself to the bathroom because he was dangerously close to crying. The weekend before his start date, Ethan took Maya shopping for new clothes. Not secondhand, not hand-me-downs, but actual new clothes from a real store. It felt extravagant and slightly wrong, like he was betraying the scarcity mindset that had governed their lives for years. But Maya's face when she picked out a dress with butterflies on it, when she realized she could actually have it, was worth every penny of guilt. "Are we rich now, Daddy?" Maya asked as they walked home with their bags. "No, sweetheart. We're just a little less poor. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "The difference is we still have to be careful, still have to make good choices, still have to work hard. But now we have a little bit of breathing room to do it." Monday arrived. Ethan put on his best clothes, khakis and a button-down that he'd bought for Jennifer's funeral and hadn't worn since, and took the subway downtown to an address Clara had given him. The building was in a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying, not quite rich, but no longer poor, the kind of in-between space where old bodegas existed next to artisanal coffee shops. The office was on the 3rd floor, a large open space that had clearly been recently renovated. Clara was there, along with 2 other people, a woman about Ethan's age named Teresa who had a social work degree and 10 years of experience in community organizing, and a younger guy named James who handled administrative and financial stuff. "Welcome to the team," Clara said, and she looked genuinely happy, like this mattered to her in a way that went beyond writing checks. They spent the morning discussing the program vision, and Ethan was relieved to discover that Clara had actually listened to him. The focus was on holistic support, not just financial assistance, but advocacy, connection to resources, help navigating systems that seemed designed to exclude people. They'd start small, serving 50 families in the immediate neighborhood, and grow based on what they learned. I don't want to assume we know what people need, Clara said, looking directly at Ethan. So we're going to spend the first month just listening. Community meetings, one-on-one conversations, surveys, whatever it takes to actually understand before we start implementing solutions. It was exactly the right approach, and Ethan felt some of his anxiety ease. Maybe this could actually work. Maybe Clara was genuine about doing this differently, about letting communities drive their own support rather than having support imposed on them.
The weeks that followed were exhausting but energizing in a way Ethan hadn't experienced in years. They held community meetings in church basements and school cafeterias, invited people to share what they were struggling with and what would actually help. Ethan listened to stories that mirrored his own: single parents working multiple jobs, families choosing between rent and food, kids who were brilliant but couldn't access opportunities because opportunities cost money. Nobody had. He took notes, asked questions, pushed back when people's suggestions seemed impractical, or when they were asking for things that would create dependency rather than empowerment. And slowly, a program took shape that was built from community input rather than external assumptions. Clara attended most of the meetings, sitting in the back, listening more than talking.
Ethan watched her absorb these stories, saw the way her understanding shifted as abstract poverty became concrete people with names and faces and specific struggles. She'd occasionally catch his eye, and he'd see in her expression a kind of awakening, a realization that she'd been operating from profound ignorance despite her good intentions. 3 months in, they launched the pilot program. Childcare co-ops where parents could trade babysitting hours, job training partnerships with local businesses, housing advocacy to help families fight unfair evictions, a community food pantry that operated like a grocery store rather than a handout line, preserving dignity while meeting needs. It wasn't perfect. There were mistakes and miscommunications and moments when Ethan wanted to quit because the problems felt too big and the solutions too small. But it was real, and it was working, and families were actually being helped in ways that mattered. One evening, 6 months after starting, Ethan sat in the now familiar office reviewing intake forms when Clara came by. She'd been doing that more often lately, stopping by not to check on him, but just to be present, to be part of the work rather than just funding it. "You look tired," Clara observed, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I am tired. Good tired, though. The kind that comes from doing something that matters rather than just surviving. Maya adjusting okay. She loves it, having a dad who's home for dinner every night, who can help with homework, who doesn't fall asleep during story time. It's revolutionary for her." Clara smiled, but there was something wistful in it. "You're good at this, you know. The community trusts you in a way they'll never trust me." "They trust you more than you think," Ethan said. "But yeah, there's a difference. You're still the rich lady who funds the program. I'm the guy who lived in the same building as half of them, who knows what it's like to choose between electricity and food." "Does that bother you? That distinction?" Ethan considered the question. "Sometimes, but mostly I'm just grateful we're both here, doing this work, even if we came to it from completely different directions." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Ethan realized that somewhere along the way they'd become something like friends. Not equals, the power dynamic was too complicated for that, but genuine allies in a project that mattered to them both. "I was wrong about a lot of things," Clara said quietly. "About what helping meant, about what money could and couldn't do, about how to actually make a difference. You were right to call me out that night in the diner. You were trying. That counts for something." "Does it? Or does trying without understanding just make things worse?" "Both can be true," Ethan said. "You were trying in the wrong way, but at least you were willing to learn a better way. A lot of people with your resources wouldn't have bothered." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Thank you for taking a chance on this. On me. Thank you for listening when I told you how to do it right." It was a small exchange, barely significant in the grand scheme of things. But it marked something important, a mutual recognition that they'd built something together, that both their perspectives had been necessary, that neither of them could have done this alone. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, 8 million people living 8 million lives, most of them struggling in ways large and small. Ethan and Clara couldn't fix all of it,
couldn't solve systemic poverty with one community program.
But they could help 50 families, and those 50 families could help others. And maybe kindness could spread the way Ethan had told Clara it could. One small act building on another until something larger emerged. It was a fragile hope, easily broken by cynicism or exhaustion or the sheer weight of need that never seemed to diminish. But it was real, and it was growing, and for now, that was enough. 3 years passed, though they felt both longer and shorter than that. Longer because so much had changed, shorter because the work never stopped long enough to measure the distance traveled. The pilot program that had started with 50 families now served 300, had expanded to 2 neighboring communities, had become something that people pointed to as an example of how support could work when it was built with communities rather than imposed upon them. Ethan's role had evolved too. He was no longer just the community program director, but the public face of an approach to poverty assistance that was being studied by social workers and replicated in other cities. He'd been invited to speak at conferences, had been quoted in articles about effective community intervention, had somehow become an expert despite still feeling like he was making it up as he went along. The strangest part was that he'd gotten comfortable with it, not comfortable enough to stop questioning himself, but comfortable enough to trust his instincts, to speak with authority about what worked and what didn't, to push back against well-meaning outsiders who wanted to help but hadn't bothered to listen first. Maya was 9 now, thriving in a way that sometimes made Ethan's chest ache with gratitude. She was still obsessed with butterflies, had started a school club dedicated to learning about and protecting pollinators, had recently announced that she wanted to be a lepidopterist when she grew up, because someone has to make sure the butterflies don't disappear, Daddy. She had friends now, real friends who came over for playdates and birthday parties. She had new clothes when she needed them, books that weren't from the library's discard pile, the ability to say yes to field trips and extracurricular activities without Ethan having to perform financial gymnastics. She was still the same kid, curious, kind, fiercely protective of her stuffed rabbit, but she carried herself with a confidence that came from not having to worry about whether her father could afford her school lunch. The medical debt was gone, paid off through a combination of his improved salary and a negotiated settlement that Clara had helped broker. The apartment was better too. They'd moved to a 2-bedroom in the same building, still 4th floor, but now Maya had her own room. Walls she'd painted yellow with Ethan's help, covered in her butterfly drawings and photos of her friends. Mrs. Chen was still on the 2nd floor, still dropping by with soup, still being the grandmother Maya had never known she needed. Carlos had joined the program staff 6 months ago, leaving the hotel to become their housing advocacy coordinator, and was currently helping families fight predatory landlords with a ferocity that came from having lived through the same struggles himself. But the work was hard, harder than Ethan had anticipated, even knowing what he knew about poverty and systemic barriers. For every family they helped stabilize, there were 5 more on the waiting list. For every small victory, a mother landing a living wage job, a child getting access to therapy, a family avoiding eviction, there were defeats that cut deep. Budget limitations that meant saying no to people who desperately needed help. Situations too complex to solve with the resources available. The slow, grinding realization that individual support couldn't fix structural problems, that they were applying bandages to wounds that required surgery. It wore on all of them, but especially on Ethan, who took every limitation personally, every person he couldn't help as evidence of his own inadequacy. Clara noticed, because Clara had gotten better at noticing over the years, had learned to read the signs of exhaustion, not just in numbers, but in the people around her. "You're burning out," she said one evening when they were both working late. The office quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic. "I'm fine," Ethan said automatically, not looking up from the grant proposal he was reviewing. "That's what you always say. And then you work through lunch and stay until 8 and come in on weekends because you can't stand the thought of someone not getting help because you took a day off." Ethan finally looked at her, exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes. "What else am I supposed to do, Clara? Tell people we can't help them because I need a vacation?" "You're supposed to build a sustainable system that doesn't depend on you working yourself to death," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're supposed to model the healthy boundaries you're always telling our clients to establish. You're supposed to trust your team to carry some of this weight. The team is already stretched thin. Then we hire more people. We expand capacity. We fundraise. We partner with other organizations. We get creative. What we don't do is sacrifice your health and your relationship with Maya because you've decided you're personally responsible for solving every problem. It was the mention of Maya that broke through Ethan's defenses. He set down his pen, rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. She asked me yesterday if I was mad at her. Claire's expression shifted into concern. Why would she think that? Because I've been distracted, short-tempered, not really present even when I'm home. She notices everything, always has, and she's learned to blame herself when adults are stressed because that's what kids do. What did you tell her? I told her I wasn't mad, that I was just tired from work. But the truth is, I'm not being the father I want to be right now. I'm not being the father I was able to be once we had stability. I'm so focused on helping other families that I'm neglecting my own. Clara was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised him. I've been thinking about stepping back. Ethan looked at her sharply. What do you mean, stepping back? Not from funding. The program will always have my financial support. But from day-to-day involvement, I think I've served my purpose here, and now I'm getting in the way more than I'm helping. That's not true. It is true, Clara said firmly. You don't need me sitting in on meetings anymore. Don't need me weighing in on decisions that you and the team are more qualified to make. I've learned what I needed to learn about doing this work with humility and respect. But I've also learned that sometimes the most helpful thing wealthy people can do is write the check and get out of the way. Ethan felt something complicated twist in his chest, relief mixed with something that felt almost like loss. Over 3 years, Clara had become more than a funder or even a colleague. She'd become a friend, someone whose perspective he valued even when they disagreed, someone who'd proven herself willing to learn and change and admit when she was wrong. I'd miss you, Ethan said quietly. Your presence in the work, I mean, not just your money. Claire's smile was warm but sad. I'd miss this too. But I'm not disappearing, Ethan. I'm just moving to where I can be most useful, which isn't in these offices every day. I've been talking to other funders, building a coalition to support community-based programs like ours across the city, trying to change how philanthropy operates at a systemic level rather than just funding one good project. That sounds like exactly what you should be doing. And you should be running this program with a co-director who can share the operational load while you focus on the community relationship work you're actually best at. I've been talking to Teresa. She's interested and qualified, and you trust her. It made sense. All of it made sense, which was why Ethan was resisting it. Because accepting help still felt like admitting weakness, even after 3 years of preaching the opposite to the families they served. Because letting go of control felt dangerous when he'd spent so long believing that his vigilance was the only thing standing between success and failure. I'll think about it, Ethan said finally. Think fast, Claire replied, because you've got a 9-year-old who needs her father present, and a team that needs a leader who's not running on fumes, and a program that's too important to let your martyrdom complex destroy it. The words were harsh but true, delivered with the kind of honesty that only real friendship could sustain. Ethan nodded, acknowledging the hit, grateful for it even as it stung. That conversation marked a turning point. Within 2 months, Teresa had stepped into a co-director role, taking over operations and administration while Ethan focused on community engagement and program design. Clara reduced her office presence to once a week, spending her other time building the funder coalition she'd described, leveraging her wealth and influence in ways that were more strategic and less intrusive. The shift gave Ethan breathing room he hadn't realized he needed. He started leaving work at 5:30, eating dinner with Maya every night, helping with homework without his mind drifting to unanswered emails. He took Saturdays off completely, spending them with Maya at museums and parks, and the library where she'd discovered a love of reading that rivaled her passion for butterflies. One Saturday morning in early spring, 4 years after that subway ride that had started everything, Ethan and Maya were walking to the community center where the program had started hosting weekend activities for families. The air was warm, the first real warmth after a brutal winter, and the neighborhood was alive with people who'd been hibernating for months. They passed the playground where Ethan had first introduced Maya to Clara, where a 6-year-old had shown butterfly drawings to a nervous billionaire. Maya barely remembered that meeting now, though she'd grown comfortable with Clara's presence in their lives.
had even started calling her Aunt Clara, with Clara's slightly flustered permission. "Daddy," Maya said, her hand in his, "can I ask you something?" "Always, Maya Bird." "Do you remember when we used to be poor?" The question caught Ethan off guard. They'd never explicitly discussed their financial situation with Maya beyond the basic mechanics of budgeting and careful spending. He'd tried to shield her from the worst of the stress, though obviously he'd failed more than he'd succeeded. "We weren't exactly poor, sweetheart. We just didn't have much extra." "Mrs. Chen says we were poor. She says you worked very hard to make sure I never felt like we were, but we were." Ethan thought about lying, about softening it further, but Maya was 9 and deserved honesty. "Yeah, we were pretty poor. Is that something you think about?" "Sometimes. Mostly I'm just grateful it's different now, but also—" She paused, working through whatever thought was forming. "I want to make sure other kids don't have to be poor like we were. Is that okay to want?" Ethan stopped walking, crouched down so he was at her eye level. "That's more than okay to want, Maya. That's exactly right to want. In fact, that's what Aunt Claire and I have been trying to do with the community program, make things better for families who are struggling like we used to." "Can kids help with that?" "Absolutely. Why do you ask?" Maya's face lit up with the enthusiasm that always preceded her big ideas. "My butterfly club wants to do a fundraiser.
We were going to donate the money to help save monarch habitats, but I was thinking, what if we donated it to the community program instead? To help families with kids like me?" Ethan felt his throat tighten with pride so fierce it was almost painful. "I think that would be amazing. How much are you hoping to raise?" "Maybe $100? We're going to sell cookies and do a butterfly garden tour and ask for donations." $100 was nothing compared to the program's budget, wouldn't even cover one family's emergency assistance. But that wasn't the point. The point was a 9-year-old who'd been raised in scarcity choosing to help others, who'd internalized not bitterness about what she'd lacked, but compassion for people still lacking. "I think your fundraiser is a great idea," Ethan said, his voice rougher than usual. "And I'm so proud of you for thinking of it. Will you help us plan it?" "I'd be honored to help." They continued walking, and Ethan found himself thinking about cycles, how poverty perpetuated itself through generations, how trauma passed down through families, how scarcity mindset became inherited wisdom, but also how kindness could perpetuate itself, how compassion could be learned and taught, how one person's choice to give up a subway seat could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. At the community center, the weekend program was in full swing. Children Maya's age and younger were in the art room, covering themselves and everything around them in paint. Teenagers were in the computer lab, working on college applications with volunteer tutors. Adults were in the main room, some attending a financial literacy workshop, others just sitting and talking, taking advantage of the free childcare to have conversations uninterrupted by small voices demanding attention. Ethan moved through the space, greeting people by name, checking in on how things were going, troubleshooting small problems before they became big ones. This was his favorite part of the job. Not the administrative work or the grant writing or the board meetings, but this direct contact with the community, the reminder of why the work mattered. He found Carlos in the housing office, deep in conversation with a young mother who looked exhausted and scared. Ethan recognized that look, had worn it himself for years. Carlos caught his eye, gave a small nod that meant he had it handled, and Ethan moved on. In the kitchen, volunteers were preparing lunch. Today was pasta with marinara sauce, salad, fresh bread from a bakery that donated their day-old inventory. The meal program had been controversial at first. Some board members worried about creating dependency, but Ethan had pushed for it hard because he remembered being so hungry and so proud that he'd skip meals rather than admit need. If families knew they could count on one good meal during weekend programming, they'd show up, and showing up was half the battle. Maya had run off to join the Butterfly Club meeting, where a dozen kids were planning their fundraiser with the fierce intensity of people on a mission. Ethan watched through the window, seeing his daughter explain her idea to the group, seeing them catch fire with it, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for years. They were going to be okay. Not perfect, not without struggles, but fundamentally okay in a way that had seemed impossible 4 years ago. "Penny for your thoughts," Claire's voice said behind him, and Ethan turned to find her standing there in jeans and a sweatshirt, dressed down in a way that still looked expensive but at least no longer screamed wealth. "Just watching Maya change the world one butterfly at a time," Ethan said. Clara looked through the window, smiled at whatever she saw there. "She's remarkable. You've done an amazing job raising her." "We've done an amazing job," Ethan corrected. "You've been part of her life for 4 years now, Clara. You get to take some credit for how she's turning out." Clara's eyes got slightly bright, and she blinked rapidly. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kind, it's true. She thinks of you as family, and family shapes who we become." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the children plan their fundraiser, watching the community center pulse with life and purpose and connection. "I've been thinking," Clara said slowly, "about that question you asked me 4 years ago, about why I cared about your daughter." "I remember. At the time, I said it was about paying forward kindness, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Clara turned to face him, her expression more vulnerable than he'd seen it in a long time. "The whole truth is that I was lonely. Profoundly, existentially lonely in a way that money couldn't fix. I had everything except meaning, everything except connection, everything except a reason to get up in the morning that mattered beyond profit margins and market share. And now? And now I have 3 godchildren in this program who call me Aunt Clara. I have families who text me photos of their kids' graduations and achievements. I have a team of funders who meet monthly to talk about how we can do better, be better, use our resources in ways that actually help rather than just making us feel good. I have a purpose that extends beyond my own comfort." She paused, then added quietly, "I have friends who see me as Clara, not Clara Whitmore the billionaire. And that's worth more than any amount of money I've ever made." Ethan felt the truth of this settle between them. 4 years of complicated relationship distilling into something simpler and more genuine. "You're not the same person who tracked me down and tried to throw money at my problems," he observed. "And you're not the same person who gave up a subway seat because that's what you do," Clara countered. "You're someone who's built something that's changing lives, who's proven that poverty assistance can work when it's done with respect and partnership." "We built it together." "Yes, we did." Clara smiled, and it reached her eyes in a way her smiles hadn't 4 years ago, when she'd still been performing competence rather than living authenticity. "And we're going to keep building it. The Funder Coalition is getting serious traction. We've got commitments for programs in 6 more neighborhoods, all using the model we developed here. Community-led, dignity-preserving, focused on empowerment rather than charity." "That's incredible." "It's necessary," Clara said. "One program serving 300 families is good. A movement serving thousands is better. And none of it would have happened if you hadn't called me out that night in the diner, if you hadn't demanded that I see you as a person rather than a project." Before Ethan could respond, Maya burst out of the Butterfly Club meeting, practically vibrating with excitement. "Daddy! Aunt Clara! We're going to do the fundraiser next month, and we're going to make butterfly gardens to sell, and we're going to have a bake sale, and we're going to write letters to people asking for donations, and Ms. Rodriguez says she thinks we could raise maybe even $200. Her enthusiasm was infectious. Her belief that $200 could change the world, both naive and absolutely correct. Because it wasn't about the amount. It was about the lesson she was learning, that helping others was possible and important, that scarcity didn't have to breed selfishness. "That sounds amazing, Maya Bird," Ethan said, pulling her into a hug. "Your club is lucky to have you as a member." "I'm lucky to have them," Maya corrected, because apparently she was 9 going on 40 and had already figured out truths about community that most adults never learned. The afternoon continued, filled with the ordinary magic of people taking care of each other, volunteers reading to children, teenagers helping with homework, adults sharing resources and advice, and the simple comfort of not being alone in their struggles. It wasn't perfect, wasn't anywhere close to solving the massive structural problems that created poverty in the first place. But it was real, and it mattered, and it was expanding. As evening approached and families started heading home, Ethan found himself back outside the community center with Clara, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for a neighborhood that was still struggling despite all their efforts. "Do you ever wish you could do more?" Ethan asked. Fix everything, not just make small improvements? Every day, Clara admitted. But I've learned that small improvements are how you build toward big change. You don't revolutionize systems overnight. You chip away at them, one community at a time, one family at a time, one child who grows up knowing that kindness and support are possible. That's a long game. It's the only game worth playing. Clara looked at him, and her expression was serious. 4 years ago, I thought I could swoop in and save you. I thought wealth gave me the right to make decisions about other people's lives. I was wrong about almost everything except one thing. You were worth knowing. Your perspective was valuable. And I'm grateful you were patient enough to teach me how to be useful instead of just feeling useful. Ethan considered this, thought about all the conversations and conflicts and slow building of trust that had brought them to this moment. I was pretty hard on you that night in the diner. I needed you to be hard on me. Nobody else in my life was honest enough to tell me I was being a controlling savior instead of an actual helper. Well, for what it's worth, you're an actual helper now. You've learned, you've changed, you've used your resources in ways that actually empower rather than diminish. High praise from someone who doesn't give it lightly. They smiled at each other, and Ethan realized that this was what success looked like, not the elimination of poverty or struggle, but the building of networks strong enough to catch people when they fell, the creation of communities where helping was normalized rather than exceptional, the slow transformation of systems that had been designed to exclude. Maya emerged from the building, butterfly drawing in hand, ready to go home. She took Ethan's hand automatically, offered her other hand to Clara without thinking about it, and they walked together to the subway station, the same station where this had all started, where a tired man had given up a seat and inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that had changed multiple lives. The platform was crowded with Saturday evening commuters, people heading home from work or out for the evening, all of them carrying their own stories and struggles invisible to everyone else. The train arrived and they boarded together, finding spots near the door. Across the car, Ethan watched a young woman offer her seat to an elderly man, watched the man accept with quiet gratitude, watched the small transaction of kindness pass unmarked by everyone except him. He caught Clara's eye, saw that she'd noticed it too, and they shared a look of understanding. This was how it worked. Not through grand gestures or massive interventions, but through small moments multiplied across millions of lives. One person giving up a seat, one person seeing another's need and choosing to meet it, one person teaching a child that helping matters, that community is real, that we're not meant to struggle alone. The train rocked through the darkness, carrying them home through tunnels that had witnessed countless small kindnesses and quiet cruelties, that would continue witnessing them long after Ethan and Clara and Maya were gone. But for now, in this moment, 3 people who'd been strangers 4 years ago stood together, bound by a connection that had started with nothing but has grown into something that mattered. Maya hummed between them, some song from school, unaware that she was the living proof that poverty didn't have to be permanent, that struggle didn't have to define a life. That one moment of kindness could ripple outward into years of change. The train pulled into their stop. They exited together, climbed the stairs to street level, emerged into an evening that was growing cool but not yet cold. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of new growth, of butterflies emerging from cocoons, of small transformations that accumulated into something larger. Same time next week? Clara asked, because Saturday volunteering had become part of her routine, part of what gave her life meaning beyond the accumulation of wealth. Same time next week, Ethan confirmed. Clara crouched down to Maya's level. Good luck with your fundraiser planning, kiddo. Let me know if you need any advice on logistics. I will, Aunt Clara. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for letting me be part of your life. Clara stood, gave Ethan a quick hug that had become natural over the years, and headed toward her car. Ethan watched her go, this woman who'd started as a stranger with too much money and too little wisdom and had become someone he genuinely respected and cared about. He and Maya walked the remaining blocks to their building, past the bodega with the cat, past the church with the updated sign announcing a community meal program they'd helped establish, past the lot that was finally being developed into affordable housing after years of advocacy. The neighborhood was changing, slowly but noticeably, becoming more stable without losing its character, creating opportunities without displacing the people who'd lived there through harder times. It wasn't perfect. Gentrification still threatened. Landlords still tried to exploit. Poverty still ground down families despite their best efforts. But it was better, measurably better, and that was worth celebrating. Mrs. Chen was sitting on the front steps when they arrived, enjoying the evening air. She smiled at Maya, who ran over to tell her about the Butterfly Club fundraiser with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never learned that adults might not want to hear every detail of children's projects. Mrs. Chen listened with the patience of someone who'd lived long enough to know that children's enthusiasms were precious and fleeting, that these moments of unguarded excitement would pass too quickly into the self-consciousness of adolescence and then the responsibilities of adulthood. "Very good, Maya," Mrs. Chen said when the breathless explanation finally concluded. "You are becoming someone who helps others. This is the best thing to become. Daddy always says that people who help make the world better. Your daddy is right. He is also someone who helps. You are learning from good example." They went upstairs to their apartment, the one that was clean and warm and felt like home, in a way their old place never quite had despite Ethan's best efforts. Maya went to her room to work on butterfly drawings for the fundraiser. Ethan started making dinner, something simple, pasta with vegetables, but nutritious and plentiful, the kind of meal that was ordinary now, but would have felt like luxury 4 years ago. As he cooked, Ethan found himself thinking about Jennifer, about how she would have loved to see Maya now, confident and kind and full of purpose. He'd stopped having those late-night conversations with her photo, not because he'd forgotten her, but because he'd finally made peace with her absence, had learned to carry the grief without letting it consume him. She would have approved of Clara, he thought, would have appreciated someone willing to learn and change, someone who'd taken her wealth and used it to actually help rather than just to feel good about helping. Jennifer had believed in people's capacity for growth, had been good at seeing potential even when it was buried under layers of selfishness or ignorance. "Daddy," Maya called from her room, "can you come look at this drawing?" Ethan set down his spoon and went to her room, where she'd created an elaborate butterfly garden scene with families gathered around it, children and adults together, helping each other and the butterflies simultaneously. It was more sophisticated than her drawings from 4 years ago, showing genuine artistic development, but it still had that same earnest quality, that belief that beauty and kindness could coexist. "It's perfect, Maya Bird," Ethan said, meaning it. "Are you going to use this for the fundraiser?" "I was thinking we could sell prints of it, and all the Butterfly Club members could sign them, and people would buy them because they'd be helping both butterflies and families." "That's a brilliant idea. I learned it from you and Aunt Clara. You're always talking about how good programs help more than one thing at the same time, how you look for what you call synergy." Ethan laughed, delighted and slightly appalled that his 9-year-old was using nonprofit jargon. "Yes, synergy, multiple benefits from a single action." "Exactly. So this way, people who care about butterflies help families, and people who care about families help butterflies, and everyone wins." She was going to change the world, Ethan thought. Maybe not in the dramatic ways that made headlines, but in the quiet, persistent ways that actually mattered, teaching by example, helping where she could, building connections that made communities stronger. They ate dinner together, talking about Maya's day and Ethan's work, and the butterfly fundraiser that was growing more elaborate with each conversation. After dinner, they did the dishes together, then settled in for their Saturday night movie tradition, something animated that Maya had picked out from the library. Halfway through the movie, Maya fell asleep against Ethan's shoulder, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of child sleep. Ethan let her stay there rather than waking her to move to bed, savoring this moment of peace and closeness, storing it away against the inevitable day when she'd be too old for falling asleep during movies, too independent to want to lean against her father. The movie ended. Ethan carefully shifted Maya into his arms, carried her to her bed, tucked her in with the rabbit and the covers, and a kiss on her forehead. In sleep, she looked even younger than 9, vulnerable and perfect, and Ethan felt that familiar wave of fierce love mixed with terror at how easily it could all be lost. But it wouldn't be lost, he reminded himself. They'd built something stable now, had created a life with margin and support and community. Maya would grow up knowing that struggle wasn't permanent, that help was available, that kindness was real and worth practicing. In his own room, Ethan changed into pajamas and lay down, exhausted but satisfied in a way he hadn't been during those years of constant survival mode. He picked up his phone, saw a text from Clara sent an hour ago. "Thank you for today, for letting me be part of something real. I don't say it enough, but it means everything to me." He texted back, "Thank you for being willing to learn, for seeing us as people, not projects. We built something good together." Her response came quickly. "We did, and we're going to keep building it." Ethan set down his phone and closed his eyes, and for the first time in years he fell asleep without running through the next day's problems, without mentally cataloging crises that needed solving. He just slept, deeply and dreamlessly, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would come and they'd handle it, whatever it brought. 5 years after a simple gesture on a subway train, two lives that should never have intersected had become permanently intertwined, had created something larger than either of them alone. A program that was spreading across the city. A child who'd learned that poverty wasn't destiny. A billionaire who'd discovered that meaning couldn't be bought, but could be built. A community that was stronger because people had chosen to help each other. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic solution, no sudden transformation of systemic injustice into universal prosperity. The work continued, would always continue, because poverty and inequality were problems too large for any one program or person to solve. But it was real, and it was growing, and it proved that change was possible when people approached it with humility and respect and genuine partnership. And sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet, Ethan would remember that moment on the subway, standing with Maya, seeing a tired woman who needed a seat, making the choice to give it up because that's what you do when you want to live in a world where people take care of each other. He'd had no idea where that choice would lead, had no conception that one small act of kindness would ripple outward into years of connection and change and growth. But that was how it worked, he'd learned. Real change didn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It moved quietly, person to person, moment to moment, building slowly into something substantial enough to bear weight. One person giving up a seat, one person saying thank you, one person choosing to learn instead of assuming, one person demanding respect instead of accepting charity, one child growing up knowing that kindness matters, and somehow, impossibly, all of it adding up to something that looked like hope, like progress, like the beginning of a better way forward. The city slept around them. 8 million people in 8 million lives, all of them struggling and striving, and occasionally, beautifully, choosing to help each other despite having every reason not to. And in that choosing, in that persistent, unglamorous, everyday kindness, was everything that mattered, everything worth building, everything worth fighting for. The story ended where it began, with people on trains, in buildings, on streets, living their complicated lives and sometimes, when the moment called for it, choosing to see each other's humanity and respond with grace. Small acts multiplied across millions of lives, kindness in motion, spreading forward, one moment at a time.